She didn't stop to think. She didn't stop to look around and check who was watching. When every silk-gowned woman in that ballroom turned her face away from the old woman crumpled on the floor, Elizabeth Carter picked up her skirts and ran. She dropped to her knees on the cold marble. She took those trembling hands in her own. And in that single moment, without knowing it, without wanting anything from it, she changed the entire course of her life. If this kind of story moves you, subscribe to our channel and follow Elizabeth's journey all the way to the end. And drop a comment telling us what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The summer of 1818 arrived in Virginia, the way it always did. Heavy, breathless, and smelling of honeysuckle and horse sweat, and the particular desperation of families who had spent the entire year calculating how close they could get to the Whitmore name. By the third week of July, every parlor in the county had been rearranged. Every daughter had been fitted, laced, and instructed. Every mother had rehearsed the precise angle of a compliment that sounded spontaneous, but wasn't. The Whitmore summer gathering was not a party. It had never been just a party. It was, and everyone understood this without saying it plainly, a selection. Nathaniel Whitmore was 34 years old. He owned 11,000 acres of the finest land in the Shenandoah Valley. He held controlling interest in 2 shipping concerns out of Norfolk and a timber operation that made men with 3 times his education tip their hats when his name came up in conversation. He had never been married. He had been engaged once briefly to a woman from a Philadelphia family whose father had quietly assured Nathaniel that his daughter was gentle, educated, and admirably suited to the management of a great house. The engagement had lasted 4 months. It had ended the evening Nathaniel overheard his intended describing him in bright, animated detail to her cousin as the most efficient solution to our family's situation that God has yet provided. He had not been engaged since. That was 6 years ago. His mother, Margaret Whitmore, had said very little when he broke it off. She was not a woman who wasted words. She had simply folded her hands in her lap, looked at him for a long moment, and said, "Then we will find another way." He had not known then what she meant by that. He was beginning to suspect he still didn't. The gathering had been her idea. "You cannot find a worthy woman," she told him in May, "by sitting in your study reading land surveys. You have to put yourself where people are." "People," Nathaniel said, "are exactly the problem." "Then we will find someone who isn't like people," Margaret said simply, and that had been the end of the conversation. Elizabeth Carter arrived at Whitmore Manor in a borrowed carriage. She wanted that fact stated plainly, not because she was ashamed of it. She wasn't, but because she had learned in 23 years of living that pretending something was other than what it was only made the eventual truth more humiliating. The carriage belonged to the Hendersons, her neighbors, who were attending the gathering themselves, and had offered her a seat rather than see her walk 4 miles in the Virginia heat. She had accepted, thanked them honestly, and spent the ride with her hands folded in her lap, while Mrs. Henderson's 2 daughters whispered to each other behind their fans, in ways they clearly believed she couldn't hear. Her father was a minister. Was dead 3 years. She lives with an aunt now. The aunt takes in mending. And she was invited. Apparently, Mr. Whitmore's man delivers invitations to every family in the county. The Whitmore name being what it is, everyone comes. Even the ones who have no business coming. Elizabeth looked out the window. The road curved through a stand of white oaks, and the light came through the leaves in long tilted shafts, the way it did in late afternoon in July, and she thought, "I have as much business being anywhere as anyone else does." She believed that. She had always believed it. She just understood that believing it and having other people believe it were 2 entirely separate endeavors. She had not come to catch a husband. She wanted that stated plainly, too. She had come because her Aunt Ruth had pushed the invitation across the breakfast table and said, "You are 23 years old, Elizabeth Ann Carter, and you have exactly 1 good dress and a talent for turning down every opportunity God sets in front of you." And because underneath the stubbornness she had inherited from her father and the pride she had cultivated entirely on her own, Elizabeth had thought just maybe that going somewhere beautiful for an evening might do her some good. She was not looking for Nathaniel Whitmore. She was not particularly looking for anyone. The ballroom of Whitmore Manor was the largest room Elizabeth had ever stood in. She registered that fact the way she registered most things directly, without embarrassment, without pretending she had seen grandeur. She hadn't. The Henderson girls had swept ahead of her the moment the carriage stopped angling toward the clusters of young women near the refreshment tables like homing pigeons, finding their roost. Elizabeth stood at the edge of the room and simply looked. There were perhaps 200 people. The women were dressed in the kind of silks and muslins that cost more than her aunt earned in 6 months. The men stood in groups and talked in the low, deliberate voices of people who had learned early that sounding certain was more important than being certain. Candles burned in 3 enormous chandeliers overhead. Someone was playing the pianoforte near the far wall, something precise and European that Elizabeth didn't recognize. She found a spot near a column where she was unlikely to be spoken to and unlikely to be in anyone's way, and she watched. She had a gift for watching. Her father had told her that once. "You see things other people step past," he'd said. "That's either going to save you or trouble you considerably depending on the day." She had been 13. She hadn't known what he meant then. She thought she was starting to. She saw, for example, the young woman in the rose-colored gown who touched Nathaniel Whitmore's arm twice in the first 10 minutes of the evening and laughed at everything he said, including Elizabeth was almost certain things that were not meant to be amusing. She saw the 2 mothers stationed near the doorway who tracked their daughters through the crowd, the way a hawk tracks a field mouse with absolute patience and absolute intent. She saw a man near the punch bowl pocket a small silver spoon when he thought no one was looking. She saw in the corner near the musicians a woman sitting alone. The woman was old. Not gently old the way some women were softened by years into something pleasant and lavender-scented. She was sharply old, angular. Her dress was gray and plain and entirely out of place in that room. Her hands were folded on her lap. She was watching the crowd the way Elizabeth was watching it directly, without pretending to be doing anything else. And there was something in her face that Elizabeth recognized without being able to name it. She looked like someone who had decided a long time ago that she would see things as they were. Elizabeth didn't think much about her. She noted her the way she noted the spoon, and the laughing woman, and the tracking mothers. And then the music shifted into a livelier reel, and the floor opened up, and Elizabeth moved slightly further back toward the wall to give the dancers room. It happened fast. One moment the old woman was in her corner. The next she was moving slowly, stiffly toward the edge of the room, navigating through the crowd with the careful deliberateness of someone who was not entirely sure of her footing. Elizabeth tracked her out of habit. She watched the old woman reach the outer edge of the dancing crowd. She watched her pause. She watched her reach out for a nearby chair as if she meant to steady herself. She watched her miss. The old woman went down. Not dramatically, not the way people fell in stories with a cry and a flutter. She simply went down quietly and completely, one moment upright, and the next folded on the floor between 2 towering potted ferns, and the sound of it was barely audible over the music. The music didn't stop. 2 women nearby turned their heads. One of them, a tall, elegant woman in green silk, perhaps 30, with the kind of cheekbones that suggested a great deal of inherited confidence, looked at the old woman on the floor and then looked away. "Someone ought to fetch a servant," she said to her companion. "Someone will." Her companion agreed, and they moved on. A man stepping from the dance floor nearly walked over the woman's outstretched hand. He caught himself, glanced down, and redirected his path without slowing. Elizabeth was already moving. She didn't decide to move. There was no moment of calculation, no weighing of how it would look or what people would say, or whether crossing the entire length of the ballroom in a plain blue dress that wasn't hers was the kind of thing a woman in her position ought to be doing in front of 200 people who already considered her an afterthought. There was just the old woman on the floor, and the fact that nobody was helping her, and Elizabeth's feet were moving before her mind had finished forming the thought. She picked up her skirt. The dress was already plain enough that worrying about it was pointless, and she walked fast, then faster, cutting through the edge of the dancing crowd in a way that earned her 2 sharp looks and 1 muttered comment she didn't stop to hear. She reached the old woman and dropped straight to her knees on the floor. "Ma'am." Her voice was steady. "Ma'am, look at me. I've got you. Up close." The woman's face was pale. Not the pale of fainting, but the pale of pain, and of a particular kind of dignity, that was working very hard to remain intact. Her gray eyes were sharp and clear. She was pressing her lips together against something embarrassment, Elizabeth thought, or possibly her knee. "I'm quite all right," the old woman said. Her voice was steady too, though Elizabeth could see the effort it cost her. "You're not?" Elizabeth said, not unkindly. "You've hurt your knee, I think. Let me help you sit up." "I don't need—" "I know you don't need it," Elizabeth said. "I'm going to help you anyway." There was a very brief pause. The old woman's gray eyes moved over Elizabeth's face with a quality of attention that seemed for a moment entirely out of proportion to the situation. Then something shifted in her expression, something small and settled and almost satisfied, and she allowed Elizabeth to take her arm. Getting her upright was slow work. Elizabeth was not a large woman, and the old woman had more weight than she looked. Elizabeth braced herself and pulled steadily and talked quietly. Nothing important. Just the kind of running commentary that made people feel less alone in difficult moments. "That's it. Take your time. I've got your arm, I won't let go. There we are. Easy." When the old woman was finally seated in the chair, Elizabeth had pulled close. Elizabeth sat back on her heels on the floor and looked up at her. "Better." "My knee," the old woman admitted. "It isn't broken, but it isn't happy. Can I bring you water? Or find someone to help get you somewhere more comfortable?" "You could," the old woman said. "Sit down and talk to me for a moment, if you aren't required elsewhere." Elizabeth glanced toward the rest of the room. Nobody was watching them. Or rather, people had glanced over when Elizabeth had moved, and some of them were still cutting looks in their direction, but the specific quality of those looks was the one Elizabeth knew well, the kind that assessed and dismissed in the same motion. Nothing important happening over there. Just that plain girl and the old woman nobody knew. "I'm not required anywhere," Elizabeth said. She looked around for another chair, found one 2 feet away, dragged it over and sat down. "You didn't stop to think about it," the old woman said. She wasn't asking. "About what?" "About whether helping me was worth it." The old woman tilted her head slightly. "Most people stopped. You didn't." "Most people," Elizabeth said, "ought to be embarrassed about that." "Most people aren't." "No," Elizabeth agreed. "They aren't." The old woman was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "What's your name?" "Elizabeth Carter. My father was Reverend James Carter. He died 3 years ago. I live with my Aunt Ruth Simmons about 4 miles from here." "You volunteer a great deal of information." "People usually want to know where I fit," Elizabeth said. "I find it saves time to tell them plainly, so they can make whatever calculations they're going to make, and we can get on with the conversation." The old woman's eyes sharpened again with that particular quality of attention. "And what calculations do you imagine I'm making?" "That I'm not a suitable match for your son," Elizabeth said. "Or your nephew. Whoever it is you've come this evening to consider." There was a pause. Then the old woman said, "My name is Martha." She paused. "I'm nobody in particular." "All right, Martha," Elizabeth said. They sat together for a while. Elizabeth asked if the knee was swelling, and Martha said probably. Elizabeth found a cloth at the refreshment table and soaked it in cold water from the pitcher and brought it back and wrapped it around Martha's knee without being asked, and Martha let her. And they talked carefully at first, then less carefully about the summer, and about the particular social mathematics of a gathering like this one, and about whether the pianoforte player knew he was hitting the third measure of the second piece slightly flat, or whether he was doing it on purpose. "On purpose," Martha said definitively. "You think, he's watching the woman in the blue at the far end of the room. He's been watching her for 20 minutes. He's too distracted to be making the same mistake accidentally." Elizabeth looked. The woman in blue was talking to a man near the doorway and showed no awareness of the musician whatsoever. "Poor man," Elizabeth said. "Poor nothing. He should pay attention to his playing." But Martha said it with something almost like warmth. Elizabeth stayed. She stayed while the reel ended and a slower piece began. She stayed while the Henderson girls found the dance floor and the mothers near the door repositioned. She stayed while the woman in green silk, the one who had looked at Martha and looked away, moved closer to the center of the room and laughed at something Nathaniel Whitmore said, with the practiced musical quality of a woman who had been taught to laugh at exactly the right moments. She stayed because Martha was interesting, because the knee needed the cold cloth refreshed every few minutes, because honestly, she was more comfortable here at the edge of things talking to an old woman with sharp eyes than she would have been anywhere else in that room. She didn't notice Nathaniel Whitmore notice her. But he did. Nathaniel Whitmore had spent the first hour of his own party doing what he always did at these things, moving through the room, making the expected conversations, accepting the expected compliments, observing the expected parade of daughters who had been dressed and instructed and sent to impress him. He was not unkind about it. He understood the economics of it. He understood that marriages in Virginia in 1818 were for most families as much business as sentiment. He did not hold that against anyone. He just didn't know how to want it. He had been standing near the windows, half listening to a very confident young man from Richmond, explaining his family's recent land acquisitions when the movement caught his eye. A flash of plain blue. A woman moving through the crowd fast, not in the gliding, careful way women moved at these things, but with actual directional purpose, the kind of movement that meant something had her attention more than anything else in the room. He tracked her across the floor. He saw her reach his mother. He saw her drop straight to her knees without hesitation. His mother had been very clear before the gathering about what she was doing. "I will see them as they are," she had told him. "Not as they present themselves. Anyone can be charming for an evening. I want to see what they do when they think nothing important is happening." He had told her it was excessive. She had told him it was necessary. Now he watched a woman he had never seen before kneel on the floor of his ballroom and take his mother's hands in hers, and he thought against everything he had trained himself against, thinking that his mother might have been right. He excused himself from the Richmond man's land acquisition story. He didn't approach his mother. He wasn't ready to interrupt whatever was happening. He moved to a position closer to the far wall, not conspicuously, just enough, and he watched. He watched Elizabeth Carter sit down in a chair that she had dragged over herself. He watched her talk to his mother with the ease of someone who had decided immediately and without apparent deliberation that this was exactly where she should be. He watched her go to the refreshment table and come back with a cold cloth. He watched her rewrap his mother's knee. He watched his mother, who had been largely impenetrable to strangers for the 20 years since his father died, lean forward in her chair and laugh. He had not seen his mother laugh without calculation in a very long time. The woman in the blue dress had her head tilted and was saying something. Whatever it was made his mother's eyes light up with that sharp, entirely authentic delight that she reserved for people who had genuinely surprised her. Nathaniel could count on one hand the number of people who had surprised his mother in the past decade. He counted his fingers. He looked back at the woman in the blue dress. He thought, "Who is she?" saying. The evening ended without incident. His mother allowed herself to be helped to a sitting room by Elizabeth and a footman Elizabeth had sensibly summoned rather than trying to manage it alone. Nathaniel watched from the doorway, not hiding exactly, but not announcing himself. He heard his mother say, "You needn't stay, I have people now." He heard Elizabeth say, "I know, I'll go once I know you're settled." He heard his mother say, "You're a stubborn girl." He heard Elizabeth say with a particular clarity that was not quite amusement and not quite seriousness, "I've been told that before." The Henderson girls found Elizabeth eventually and pulled her toward the carriage with the efficiency of people who had gotten what they came for and were ready to leave. He watched Elizabeth go, stopping once to look back at the door to the sitting room where his mother was, the way a person checks on something they care about. Then she was gone. Nathaniel stood in the empty hallway for a moment. Then he went to find his mother. She was in this blue sitting room, her leg propped on a footstool, a cup of tea in her hands, and the most serene expression on her face he had seen in a considerable while. "Well," he said. "Well," she agreed. "Your knee will survive." He pulled up a chair across from her and sat down. Outside he could hear the last carriages departing, the sounds of the gathering dissolving into the night. "Who was she?" he said. His mother looked at him over her teacup. "You noticed?" "I notice most things." "No," his mother said. You notice most things you're looking for. You weren't looking for her." She paused. "Her name is Elizabeth Carter. Her father was a minister. He died 3 years ago. She lives with her aunt about 4 miles from here." "She told you all of that. In the first 2 minutes, she said she finds it saves time." His mother looked at him with the expression she wore when she was deciding how much of what she was thinking to say. "She wrapped my knee without being asked. She talked to me as though I were a person rather than an obligation. She stayed for over an hour, and the entire time she wasn't watching the door to see if anything better was happening." She paused again. "She's nobody, Nathaniel, by every calculation this county uses. She has no fortune, no family name, no connections. I know." "She's also," his mother said quietly, "exactly what I've been looking for." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "You planned this," he said. "I set conditions," his mother said. "The rest was up to the people in the room." She sipped her tea. "Most of them failed rather spectacularly. The woman in the green gown looked directly at me and walked around me. I watched her do it. I want you to remember that next time she smiles at you." "I'll remember." "The woman in the blue dress," his mother said, "helped me and then told me plainly who she was so I could make whatever calculations I was going to make." Her eyes were steady. "She knew I might be nobody. She helped me anyway. And then she sat with me because she found me interesting." She set down her cup. "I can count those people on one hand, Nathaniel. In 68 years I can count them on one hand." Nathaniel looked at the floor. "She won't be easy," his mother said. "She has too much pride for easy, and she's been told she doesn't matter often enough that she'll resist the first 3 times you try to tell her otherwise." She paused. "But she's real. She's genuinely, entirely real. And you have been surrounded by performance for so long that I think you've nearly forgotten what real looks like." He didn't answer that because she wasn't wrong. "Find out who she is," his mother said. "The real version, not what the county says." The real version, as Nathaniel discovered over the following 2 weeks, was this. Elizabeth Carter woke before 5 every morning to start the bread, because her aunt's hands had stiffened too much to manage the kneading. She walked to the Henderson farm twice a week to help with the sick daughter who had been in bed since spring. She taught reading to 3 children in the village whose families couldn't afford a proper tutor on Tuesday and Thursday mornings in the back of the church that had been her father's, using her father's books. She did all of this without advertising it. She did all of this without, as far as Nathaniel could determine, expecting anything in return. He found out because he asked. He asked specifically Reverend Howell, who had taken over his father's congregation, what he could tell him about Elizabeth Carter. And Reverend Howell, who was a practical man rather than a romantic one, had said, "What do you want to know?" The quick version is that she does the work and asks nobody's permission and doesn't expect thanks. And then he'd paused and said, "The longer version is more or less the same, just with more detail." Nathaniel rode past the church on a Thursday morning. He did not intend to stop. He stopped. Through the window he wasn't peering, he had simply angled slightly in that direction. He could hear a voice reading. Clear, unhurried, patient. Reading a passage from something. Then stopping. Then saying, "Now you." And a child's voice picking up the words, stumbling, correcting, going on. "Good," Elizabeth's voice said. "Better than last week. Miss Carter," a small voice. "What's a benediction?" "It's a blessing," Elizabeth said. "When someone says a benediction, they're saying may good things happen to you. May you be kept safe." "Do you say benedictions?" A pause. "Sometimes," Elizabeth said. "When I want something good to happen to someone and I can't do it myself, I say a prayer for them instead. It's the same idea." Another pause. "Miss Carter." "Yes. Can you say a benediction for my ma? She's been real tired lately." "I already have," Elizabeth said simply. 2 days ago. But I'll say another one right now if you want." "Yes, please." And Elizabeth said a prayer in her father's church for a woman she barely knew, at the request of a child whose family couldn't pay her for the teaching, in the same plain, direct tone she used for everything else, as though it was simply what you did when you were able, and someone needed it. Nathaniel sat on his horse outside the window and thought about the woman in the green gown who had stepped around his mother on the floor. He rode home. He told his mother what he had found. "Well," she said in the tone of a woman who had expected exactly this. "Well," he said, "what are you going to do?" Nathaniel looked at his hands. "I don't know yet," he said. "She's not going to want to be approached as a prospect. She'll consider it insulting." "She will," his mother agreed, "and I'm not sure how to approach her as anything else without it looking like what it is." "What is it?" He considered that question more carefully than it probably warranted. "Honest interest," he said finally. "I'm honestly interested in who she is." His mother smiled, the genuine one, the one she didn't waste on people. "Then start there," she said. "Just be honest. She'll respect it if nothing else." He knew she was right. He also knew it was going to be considerably more complicated than that, not because Elizabeth Carter was complicated, but because the world they both lived in was, and because what he was starting to feel sitting across from his mother in the blue sitting room, while the last sound of carriage wheels faded on the summer road, was something he hadn't felt in 6 years. He felt very cautiously the beginning of hope, and hope, Nathaniel Whitmore had learned, was the most dangerous thing a careful man could carry. He told himself it was courtesy. That was the word Nathaniel used in the privacy of his own reasoning when he instructed his man Thomas to find out which road the Carter property sat on and whether the lane was passable by horse. Courtesy. A gentleman followed up. A gentleman, particularly one whose mother had been left on the floor of a ballroom and helped by a stranger, made certain that stranger knew her kindness had been noted and appreciated. It was the correct thing to do. It was simply what a man of his position ought to do, and the fact that he had been thinking about Elizabeth Carter every morning for 12 days running had nothing whatsoever to do with it. Thomas found out which road. Thomas also found out without being asked that Elizabeth Carter walked that road every Tuesday and Thursday morning, leaving the Carter-Simmons property at 7:30, arriving at the old Whitmore Chapel, which the county still called by the family name, even though Nathaniel's grandfather had deeded it to the congregation 40 years ago, at approximately 8 o'clock. Thomas delivered this information in the completely neutral tone of a man who had served Nathaniel for 9 years, and had developed over those 9 years a very precise understanding of which pieces of information his employer actually wanted, and which ones he only thought he didn't. "Thank you, Thomas," Nathaniel said. "Of course, sir," Thomas said. Nathaniel rode out on a Tuesday. He told himself he was going to the chapel to speak with Reverend Howell about the repairs to the east wall, which did in fact need attention, and which he had in fact been meaning to address since April. He arrived at the chapel at 10 minutes past 8. Reverend Howell was not yet in. The side door was open. From inside came the sound of a child reading aloud slowly and carefully, with Elizabeth Carter's voice underneath it, patient, unhurried, saying, "Good. Keep going." He waited outside. He was fully aware of how this looked. He did not particularly care, which was itself a thing worth noticing, because Nathaniel Whitmore had for the better part of 6 years cared considerably about how things looked. He had been very deliberate about it. Deliberateness was the only reliable armor a man had against a world that was constantly trying to hand him the wrong thing and convince him it was what he wanted. The lesson ran another 20 minutes. He heard it end, heard the scrape of chairs, heard a child ask whether Thursday would cover the next chapter, heard Elizabeth say yes, heard goodbyes in the voices of children who meant them. Then quiet. He waited another 2 minutes. Then he went to the door. Elizabeth Carter was stacking books on the front pew when he walked in. She turned at the sound of his boots on the wood floor, and for a moment she just looked at him, not with the careful appraising attention of someone who was calculating an opportunity, but with the simple directness of someone who was deciding whether she was surprised or not. She decided she wasn't. "Mr. Whitmore," she said. Not warmly, not coldly, simply. "Miss Carter," he said. He stopped a reasonable distance away. "I apologize for interrupting." "You didn't interrupt. They've already gone." She set the last book on the pile. "Are you here to see Reverend Howell?" "He isn't in yet." "He's usually here by 9. She picked up the books. "You're welcome to wait." She was already moving toward the small side room where her father had kept his study materials. He should have let her go. Instead, he said, "Miss Carter, I came to thank you." She stopped. She turned around and she looked at him with that same direct assessment, and she said, "You don't need to." "I think I do." "Your mother was sitting on the floor," Elizabeth said. "Any person with ordinary human decency would have done the same." "Several people with ordinary human decency chose not to," he said. Something moved through her expression, at that not pleasure at the compliment he noticed, but something more complicated. A recognition, maybe. A brief, involuntary acknowledgement that he was right, and she had known he was right from the moment it happened and hadn't quite known what to do with knowing it. "Is she well?" Elizabeth asked. "Her knee." "Much improved. She's been asking about you." Another flicker. "What kind of asking?" "The kind where she pretends she's only making conversation," he said, "but is actually gathering information." The corner of Elizabeth's mouth moved. Not quite a smile. "She seemed like someone who did that." "She is? Very effectively." He paused. "She said you told her who you were immediately. Your father, your aunt, all of it." "I find it saves time," Elizabeth said. The exact words she'd apparently said to his mother. She found it refreshing. Most people find it inconvenient. She shifted the books in her arms. "Mr. Whitmore, you don't need to thank me, and you don't need to make conversation to be polite. I helped your mother because she needed help and nobody else was doing it. That's the end of it." "What if I want it not to be the end of it?" he said. That landed differently than he'd intended. He could see it. She went still, not alarmed, not flattered, but very carefully neutral, in the way of someone who has learned to keep their reactions in the center of themselves until they know what to do with them. "Mr. Whitmore," she said carefully, "I know what your gathering was. I'm not unaware of what's being said about why eligible women were invited to your estate." "What's being said?" "That you're looking for a wife." She met his eyes without apology. "I'm not a suitable candidate by any measurement this county uses. I have no fortune. My family name opens no doors. I am the daughter of a dead minister living in my aunt's house, and the only currency I have is that I'm willing to work, and I don't tell lies." She paused. "So if you're here because you feel some obligation to reward a kindness with attention, please don't. I don't want to be a charity." Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. "What if I told you," he said, "that you're the first person who's spoken to me plainly in approximately 6 years?" She looked at him. "What if I told you," he went on, "that I'm not here because of obligation, and I'm not here to reward anything, and that the reason I've been thinking about you for 2 weeks is not because you helped my mother, though that mattered considerably, but because watching you do it was the first time in 6 years I've seen someone act without calculation." Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. He let her. He had learned in a life that had required him to be patient about most important things that people who thought carefully before they spoke deserved the space to do it. "That might be true," she said finally. "Or it might be that you're very good at saying things that sound sincere." "I might be," he said. "I'm asking you to give me the opportunity to demonstrate which." Another silence. The morning light was coming through the chapel windows in the long, indirect way of summer mornings. And somewhere outside, a mockingbird was running through its full repertoire with great enthusiasm, and Nathaniel stood in his dead father's chapel and waited to see whether a woman who had no reason to trust him would choose to anyway. "I walk back at noon," Elizabeth said finally. "If you want to walk with me part of the way, I won't stop you." He said, "Thank you." She said, "Don't thank me yet. I ask inconvenient questions." He almost smiled. "I've been warned." She asked inconvenient questions. She asked them the way she did everything directly without apology and with a quality of genuine interest that made it impossible to give a polished answer. They were 20 minutes up the road when she said, "What was the engagement like, the one that ended?" He stopped walking. She didn't. She kept going and he caught up in 2 strides. "You know about that. Everyone knows about it. It's been 6 years, and people are still talking about it, which tells you something about how little happens in this county." She glanced at him. "You don't have to answer." "No," he said. "I'll answer." He thought about it for a moment. It was fine. She was a pleasant woman, Her family was respectable. We understood each other in the way that people understand each other when they've been told they should. He paused. And then I heard her describe me as a solution to her family's situation, and I realized that I'd been approaching the whole enterprise the same way she had, and I just hadn't admitted it to myself. Elizabeth walked for a moment without speaking. Then she said, "That's an honest answer. You said you ask inconvenient questions." I didn't expect an honest answer just because I asked. "What did you expect?" "Something polished," she said. "Something that sounded honest without actually being it." "I told you, I'm very tired of that." She looked at him sideways, a quick evaluating glance. "What are you actually tired of?" He considered that. "Performing," he said. "Performing wealth. Performing certainty. Performing contentment." He paused. "Walking into my own house and feeling like I'm visiting." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "My father used to say that a man who performs his life for too long eventually forgets what the original looked like." He was right. He was right about most things, she said. It was extremely inconvenient. This time, he did smile. He walked with her to the fork, where the road split toward the Carter-Simmons property, and then turned back toward the manor, and she let him, and they talked the entire way. Not carefully, not with the calibrated flow of social conversation, but the way people talked when they'd decided not quite consciously that the other person was worth the real words. She told him about her father, about the way the house had gone quiet after he died, and the particular quality of that quiet, not peaceful, but evacuated, as though the person who had been generating warmth in a room had simply been removed, and everyone left was standing in the cold of it, trying to remember how to make their own. She told him her Aunt Ruth was a practical woman who showed love by making sure there was food, and by not saying things she didn't mean, and that Elizabeth had come to understand slowly that this was not a small thing. He told her about his father, about a man who had been formidable in business and surprisingly gentle with growing things, who had kept a kitchen garden behind the manor that no one was allowed to hire staff for because he wanted to do it himself, and who had spent his Sunday mornings in it with dirt on his boots and real quiet on his face. About the fact that Nathaniel had inherited the land and the shipping concerns and the timber operations. But not. He was increasingly aware the Sunday morning garden. That particular inheritance had skipped him somehow, and he wasn't sure how to get it back. "You could start a garden," Elizabeth said. "I don't know anything about gardens." "Your father didn't either the first year," she said. "He had to learn." He looked at her. "How do you know that?" "I used to ask my father for advice," she said. "My father knew about gardens. They were friendly, apparently. In the way that men who want to talk to someone but don't quite know how to say so are friendly." She glanced at him. "I found out after they both died. My aunt mentioned it once. She said your father used to come to our back gate on Sunday mornings and ask about the beans." Nathaniel was completely still for a moment. "I didn't know that," he said. "No," Elizabeth said quietly. "I don't think either of them mentioned it to anyone." She paused. "I think they just needed to talk to someone who wasn't watching them." He understood that. He understood it so precisely and completely that it sat in his chest like a weight that had always been there, that he had simply never had a word for before. They reached the fork. She stopped. He stopped. "Thank you," he said, "for the walk." "You did the walking," she said. "Miss Carter." He met her eyes. "I'd like to come to the chapel again on Thursday if that's all right." She held his gaze. He had the feeling again that she was doing something more precise than just deciding that she was measuring something with an instrument he couldn't quite see. "All right," she said finally, "but I'm not going to pretend I know what this is." "I don't know either," he said. "I think that might be the most honest thing about it." She looked at him for one more beat. Then she turned up the fork road, and he watched her go, and he stood at that fork in the road in the July heat, with something in his chest that he was still trying not to name. He came on Thursday. He came the following Tuesday. And the Tuesday after that. Reverend Howell, who was not a stupid man, mentioned once to Thomas that the east wall repairs seemed to be requiring a great deal of Mr. Whitmore's personal attention, and Thomas said with perfect composure that Mr. Whitmore was very thorough, and Reverend Howell said that he had noticed, and both men left it at that. Elizabeth didn't change how she was with him. That was the thing that undid him slowly and persistently, the way water undoes stone. She was the same every time, direct, occasionally brusque, quick to disagree, quick to laugh when something was genuinely funny, unwilling to perform either warmth or distance. She treated him with remarkable consistency, like a person rather than a circumstance. She forgot to be impressed by him, and then she forgot to forget it simply wasn't a category she appeared to be operating in. He brought her a book once, a natural history volume he thought she'd like based on something she'd said about her father's library. She accepted it with genuine pleasure, and then she said, "I'll return it when I'm finished." And he said, "It's a gift." And she said, "I don't need gifts from you." And he said, "It's not about need." And she said, "That's not how I want to operate." And he said, "Why not?" And she said with the precision of someone who had thought about this more than he had, "Because I won't be able to think clearly about you if I'm carrying obligations." He took the book back. She looked surprised. "Borrow it then," he said. "Return it when you're done. No obligation." She looked at him for a long, steady moment. Then she took the book. "You're learning," she said. Slowly, he said. "You're learning," she repeated, and she almost smiled, and he thought that might have been the finest thing anyone had said to him in years. There were, of course, people watching. There were always people watching. Virginia in 1818 ran largely on observation and interpretation, and a man of Nathaniel Whitmore's position could not walk a road twice a week with a minister's daughter without that fact entering the general circulation of county conversation. It entered. It circulated. And it came back to him as these things always did in the form of social pressure applied through the people least able to apply it directly. Caroline Holt was the first. She came to dinner at the Manor in the third week her mother had written to his mother, which was the approved method, and his mother had extended the invitation, which meant his mother had a reason for wanting Caroline Holt in the house, and he didn't know what it was yet, and that fact alone should have been enough warning. Caroline Holt was 26 and very beautiful, and from a family that had been managing a slow financial decline behind a perfectly maintained front for approximately 8 years. Nathaniel knew this because he made it his business to understand the financial realities of the county's prominent families. It wasn't judgment, it was information. It kept him from being surprised by things. Caroline sat across from him at dinner and was perfectly pleasant, and asked intelligent questions and laughed at exactly the right moments. "And over the roasted chicken," she said with a casualness that was not casual at all. "I heard you've been spending time at the old chapel. The east wall, wasn't it?" "Among other things," Nathaniel said. "How lovely," Caroline said in a tone that conveyed it was not lovely. "The minister's daughter teaches there, doesn't she, the Carter girl?" "Miss Carter teaches reading to children from families that can't afford tutors," Nathaniel said. "Yes." "How charitable of her." Caroline arranged her fork. "She was at your gathering, wasn't she, the summer party? I remember seeing her there." "She was." "I remember thinking she was very earnest." Caroline's eyes were still pleasant. The kind of earnestness that comes from not quite understanding the social terrain. Nathaniel set down his own fork, not loudly, just with finality. "Miss Carter," he said, "understands social terrain precisely. She simply declines to let it determine her behavior." He met Caroline's eyes. "I find that admirable." The table went quiet. His mother at the far end did not look up from her plate, but he saw the corner of her mouth move. Caroline Holt recovered smoothly. She was very good at recovering smoothly, and the conversation moved on. But something had been said clearly, and without decoration, and everyone at the table had heard it. Including, he was aware, Caroline's mother, who looked at him with the expression of a woman recalculating a figure that had come out wrong. After dinner, when the guests had gone, his mother came to find him in the study. "That was direct," she said. "She was being unkind about someone who isn't here to answer for herself." "She was," his mother agreed. "I also invited her here to see what you'd do." He looked at his mother. "Another test," he said. "Information," she said mildly. "You're gathering information too, Nathaniel. We all are. That's what people do." She sat down across from him. What was it you felt when she said that about Elizabeth? Angry, he said immediately, and without thinking about it. Why? He thought about it. Because Elizabeth Carter has never once said anything unkind about anyone without cause. And Caroline Holt said something unkind about her without knowing anything about her for no reason, except that Elizabeth is a threat to what she wants. He paused. It was contemptible. Yes, his mother said quietly. It was. She looked at him for a moment. And the anger. Was it the anger of a man protecting a courtesy, or something more personal than that? Nathaniel didn't answer. His mother nodded as though he had. He should have seen it coming. He was an intelligent man. He had navigated complicated situations in business and in society for more than a decade, and he understood in the abstract that the more visible his interest in Elizabeth Carter became, the more the county would have to say about it. He understood this the way he understood most things he'd rather not look at directly, at a slight remove, with the faint hope that it would resolve itself without requiring him to act. It did not resolve itself. The whispers reached Elizabeth in the 4th week. He didn't know it at first. She arrived at the chapel on a Tuesday morning and taught her class and waited for the children to leave, and then turned to him with her books under her arm and said with no preamble, "I need to ask you something." "All right," he said. "Are people talking about us?" He could have deflected. He didn't. "Yes." "What are they saying?" "That I'm spending time with you. That you're—" He stopped. "Various unkind things about your motives." "That I'm trying to trap you," Elizabeth said flatly. "Among other framings." She was quiet for a moment. Her jaw was set in a way he'd come to recognize, not anger exactly, but the specific tension of a person absorbing something they'd suspected and hoped not to have confirmed. "Elizabeth," he said. "It's Miss Carter," she said. And the correction was sharp, the first sharp thing she'd directed at him, and he understood that it wasn't about him. "Miss Carter," he said carefully. "What are you thinking?" She looked at the floor for a moment. Then she looked at him. "I'm thinking that I have been very careful my entire life not to give people cause to talk. I'm thinking that the things people are saying are exactly the things I knew they would say the moment I let you walk this road with me. And I'm thinking that I knew that, and I let it happen anyway, and I'm not sure what that means about my judgment." "It might mean," he said, "that you decided to trust something that felt true. Or it might mean," she said, "that I'm not as immune to—" She stopped. "To what?" She looked at him. And for the first time since he'd known her, for the first time in all the Tuesdays and Thursdays and the midday walks, there was something unguarded in her face. Something that she hadn't had time to put behind the directness and the plain speech and the refusal to perform. She looked for just that moment like someone who was afraid, not of him. He didn't think it was him she was afraid of. She was afraid of wanting something she wasn't supposed to want and being wrong about whether she could have it. He recognized it. He recognized it exactly because he had been afraid of the same thing for 6 years. "Miss Carter," he said quietly. "Elizabeth." He held her gaze. "I want to be very clear about something. I am not spending time with you because I feel obligated to reward a kindness. I am not spending time with you because of some notion that a gentleman ought to make good on a social debt. I am spending time with you because you are the most genuinely, entirely real person I have encountered in longer than I can account for." He paused. "And I understand if that's too much to hear. I understand if you need time to decide what you want to do with it. But I won't pretend it isn't true because people are talking." The chapel was very quiet. Elizabeth looked at him for a long time. "I need you to understand something," she said finally. "I am not interested in becoming a decoration in a wealthy man's house. I am not interested in being a circumstance. I am not interested in being someone you admire from the right kind of distance and then set aside when it becomes inconvenient." Her voice was steady. "I have too much respect for my father's name and my own to do that." "I know," he said. "You say that, but the county is already saying things, and if they get worse, if this continues and then stops, I'm the one who pays the cost of it. You go back to being Nathaniel Whitmore of 11,000 acres and a shipping concern. I go back to being the minister's daughter who thought too much of herself." "That's true," he said. And I'm not going to pretend otherwise. You're right. He paused. But I think you also know that the alternative, not taking the risk at all, doesn't mean the cost goes away. It just means you pay it in a different currency. She looked at him. You're very good at this, she said. It wasn't entirely a compliment. I'm trying to be honest, he said. You told me once that it saves time. Her jaw relaxed, just slightly. I did say that. You're allowed to tell me to go, he said. If that's what you want. I will not make this difficult. I'll respect whatever you decide. He met her eyes. But I'd like you to decide based on what you actually want, not on what the county has decided you're allowed to want. Elizabeth was very quiet. Outside, the mockingbird was back. Same tree, same full-throated performance, same relentless enthusiasm. Elizabeth Carter stood in her father's chapel, with Nathaniel Whitmore's words sitting in the air between them, and she looked at the floor, and then at him, and then at the books under her arm. I'll be here Thursday, she said finally. It wasn't yes, it wasn't nearly yes, but it was not no, and from Elizabeth Carter, who gave nothing she wasn't prepared to give in full, it was the most honest thing she could have offered him. He said, I'll be here Thursday. He picked up his hat. He walked to the door, and just before he stepped out into the July heat, he heard her say quietly to no one in particular, Lord help me. He didn't let her see him smile, but he smiled all the way home. He came on Thursday. Elizabeth had told herself on the walk home from the chapel 2 days prior that she was not going to rearrange anything about her Tuesday. She was not going to arrive earlier. She was not going to wear anything different. She was not going to think about the conversation in the chapel more than was reasonable, and she was going to be very precise about what counted as reasonable, and she was going to keep that boundary firm. She arrived 12 minutes early. She was wearing her second-best dress. She had thought about the conversation approximately 47 times. She told herself none of that meant anything, and she almost believed it. And then Nathaniel Whitmore walked through the chapel door at 8 o'clock exactly, and said, Good morning. The way he always did, without performance, without the elaborate courtesy of a man trying to make an impression, and her chest did the thing it had been doing for 3 weeks that she was absolutely not going to name. The children arrived. The lesson ran. She taught, and he sat in the back pew and read or appeared to read, and she was intensely aware of him the entire time in a way that was becoming increasingly difficult to characterize as irrelevant. When the children left, he looked up from his book and said, The Henderson girl was reading better today. She practiced, Elizabeth said. Her mother told me she's been reading aloud to the cat every evening. Does the cat appear to be benefiting? The cat appears to be deeply unimpressed. But the girl's reading has improved considerably, so something is working. He smiled. The real one, the one that came without warning and changed his whole face. She looked away before she could do anything inadvisable with the information that she found it entirely too appealing. They walked at noon. The road was harder in the heat than it had been in early July, the air thicker and heavier, and they walked in the particular rhythm they'd established over weeks. Easy silences, occasional words, no pressure to fill the space between thoughts. It was the thing she had not expected from him. She had expected him to be articulate. She had not expected him to understand that quiet between two people was not absence, but presence of a different kind. Reverend Howell asked about you, she said. What did he ask? Whether your interest in the east wall was architectural or social in nature. She glanced at him. I told him I couldn't speak to your interior motives. Wise. He laughed. He likes you, I think. He said your father used to donate anonymously to the congregation fund and pretend he hadn't. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. I didn't know that either. You're learning a great deal about your father lately. Through you, he said. And then before she could answer, that seems right somehow. That the things he kept quiet are surfacing through someone who's honest about everything. He paused. Like they were waiting for the right kind of person to carry them. She didn't answer that. She didn't know how to answer it without giving him something she wasn't ready to give yet. So she filed it in the part of herself where she kept things that required more thought and changed the subject. My aunt wants to know who you are, Elizabeth said. He looked at her. She doesn't know. She knows your name and your property and your financial situation to within approximately 15% because she read the county assessor's report, which she is not supposed to have access to, and which I have never asked her about." Elizabeth kept her face neutral. "She wants to know who you are." "Those are different questions." I told her that. She said the second question was the one worth asking. "She sounds like my mother," Nathaniel said. "I suspect they would either get along extremely well or destroy each other within 40 minutes. My money's on the latter, he said, with considerable mutual respect on both sides. Elizabeth laughed a real laugh, the kind she couldn't plan, and she felt him register it the same way she registered his real smile, with the quality of attention that meant it mattered to him. That was the thing she kept coming back to in the 47-plus times she'd reviewed their conversations. He paid attention. Not the performed attention of someone building a case for their own impressiveness. Just actual notice. Of what she said. Of what she meant. Of the difference between the two. They reached the fork. She stopped. He stopped. And she did something she had not planned to do and could not afterward fully account for. She said, "My aunt would like to meet you, if you're willing." He went still in the way she'd come to recognize the way he went still when something surprised him and he was trying not to show it. "When?" he said. "Saturday afternoon," she said. "She makes tea at 3. It's not elaborate. She doesn't have the patience for elaborate." "Saturday at 3, he said. "I'll be there." She turned up the fork road before she could change her mind. Behind her she heard him say quietly, but not quietly enough, "Lord help me." She was almost certain it was deliberate. She kept walking and did not let herself smile until she was around the bend. Ruth Simmons was 61 years old and approximately 5 feet and 2 inches of concentrated practical intelligence, wrapped in a woman who had decided sometime in her 40s that life was too short for social performance and too long to pretend she didn't notice things. She noticed, for example, the exact moment Nathaniel Whitmore stepped through her front door on Saturday afternoon and took in the small, worn sitting room with its carefully darned curtains and its stack of library books and its single good chair that had been positioned with the deliberateness of someone who wanted their guest to have the best seat without making a ceremony of the offering. He sat in the ordinary chair. Without being asked, Ruth Simmons looked at Elizabeth. Elizabeth kept her face carefully neutral. "Mr. Whitmore," Ruth said, pouring tea with the efficiency of a woman who considered the ceremony of it a necessary tax on conversation. "My niece tells me you've been walking the chapel road with her." "I have," Nathaniel said. "She also tells me you walk back alone." "Yes." "Good," Ruth said. She handed him his cup. "Elizabeth's reputation is the only currency she's got that the county can't take from her. I'd hate to see it spent carelessly." "Aunt Ruth," Elizabeth said. "Don't Aunt Ruth me. He's a grown man. He can hear plain speech." She looked at Nathaniel. "Can't you?" "I prefer it," Nathaniel said. Genuinely. Ruth studied him for a moment, with the expression of a woman running an assessment that had very precise internal criteria. Then she said, "Elizabeth's father was my brother. He was the best person I've known in 61 years. She has his instincts. She has his way of going straight at things." She paused. "She also has his capacity for being hurt by things she didn't see coming, which he never fully outgrew. I'd like to know whether you're something she didn't see coming." The room was very quiet. Nathaniel set down his cup. "Mrs. Simmons," he said, "I came to your door on a Saturday afternoon in July because Elizabeth invited me and because I wanted to meet the woman who raised her after her father died. I'm here because I want to know her. The real version of her, not a version I've constructed to suit what I want." He paused. "I can't promise I won't hurt her. I don't think anyone can promise that. But I can tell you that I'm not here casually, and I'm not here for the reasons people in this county have probably assigned to me, and I'm not going to let her pay a cost I'm not willing to pay myself." What neither of them knew, what Elizabeth had no way of knowing, and what Nathaniel knew only in the vague, generalized way of a man who has been told something without having watched it happen, was that the county had already made its decision. It had decided with the particular efficiency of small community judgment that Elizabeth Carter was positioning herself. That the walks were calculated. That the chapel was convenient cover. That a minister's daughter from a property worth nothing had identified the most eligible man in Virginia and deployed the only asset she had, an appearance of artless virtue, with the precision of someone who had planned it very carefully. The women who said this believed it. That was the thing. They weren't inventing it out of nothing. They were in their own way doing the only thing they knew how to do, taking a situation and fitting it into the framework they had. And in the framework, they had a woman without money or family name who attracted the attention of a man with both of those things, could only be doing it on purpose. The idea that she might simply be herself, and that herself might simply be enough, was not a framework they had. Elizabeth heard it first from Mary Henderson. She came to the Henderson farm on a Wednesday to check on the sick daughter, as she always did, and Mary Henderson opened the door and looked at her with the expression of a woman who cared about Elizabeth and was about to say something Elizabeth wasn't going to like, and Elizabeth thought, here it is. People are talking, Mary said. I know, Elizabeth said. They were talking 3 weeks ago. It's gotten worse. Mary stood aside to let her in. Caroline Holt's mother told 3 families at the Henderson social last week that you've been, the phrase she used was, making yourself available on the chapel road. She stopped. Like a woman soliciting attention she has no right to, Elizabeth finished. Mary's face creased. I'm sorry, Lizzie. Don't be sorry. It's what I expected. But her voice was tighter than she meant it to be. She went through to the sick girl's room and sat with her for an hour and held her hand and read to her. And all the while, the back of her mind was running the accounting she'd been running for weeks. The cost of this. The cost of that. The particular ledger that women without resources kept, in which every choice had a price, and the prices were not always fair. She walked home by herself that afternoon without stopping at the chapel. She sat down at the kitchen table. Her aunt came in, looked at her, and put the kettle on without asking. They sat together in the kitchen with the afternoon light coming through the window and the tea cooling in their cups, and neither of them said anything for a while. He's not worth it, Elizabeth said finally, if it costs me who I am. No, Ruth agreed. He's not. And if the county has already decided what I am, then being with him doesn't change that. It just confirms it in their minds. Also true. So, Elizabeth looked at her tea. So the sensible thing is to end the walks. Let the talk die down. Give people something else to discuss. Ruth was quiet for a moment. That's the sensible thing, she said. The question is whether sensible is the same thing as right. Sometimes it is. And sometimes, Ruth said, sensible is just the word we use when we're afraid, and we don't want to admit it. Elizabeth looked at her aunt. He said something similar, she said. He's observant, Ruth said. I'll give him that. She wrapped both hands around her cup. Lizzie, what do you actually want? Not what's smart. Not what protects you. What do you want? Elizabeth was quiet for a long moment. She said quietly, I want to not have to choose between being known and being safe. Ruth looked at her. Then find out if he's the kind of man who can make that possible, she said. Before you decide he isn't. She did not end the walks. She came to the chapel on Thursday, and she taught the children, and she walked with Nathaniel at noon, and she did not tell him what Mary Henderson had said. She didn't tell him because she didn't want his response to be protective. Not yet. Not until she knew whether his instinct to protect her came from genuine care or from the particular pride of a powerful man who didn't like to see something he'd claimed spoken of badly. She was still deciding which it was when everything changed. It happened on a Friday morning, 16 days after their walk in the rain. There had been a brief summer storm, and they had both refused to cut the walk short and arrived at the fork, looking like people who had made a principled stand against weather, which they had, and it happened because of a basket of bread. Ruth had made an extra loaf the day before, more than they needed, and she left it on the table Friday morning with a note that said simply, for whoever. Ruth's charity operated this way, unnamed, untracked, delivered on instinct. Elizabeth took the basket and the bread and the small jar of honey that she added herself, and she thought about the old woman from the gathering. Martha. She hadn't thought about her in a while. She'd thought about her in the first days after the party, the sharp gray eyes, the quality of attention, the way she'd laughed with her whole face at something Elizabeth had said about the pianoforte player. She'd wondered once or twice whether the woman had family who looked after her, whether the knee had healed properly, whether she'd found the kind of care she'd needed. She didn't know she didn't know where she lived. But there was a widow's cottage about 2 miles east of the chapel, one of a cluster of small properties that had come into Whitmore management after the previous owner died without heirs, and Reverend Howell had mentioned once that an elderly woman had been living there through the summer. It was almost certainly someone else. But Elizabeth took the basket anyway. She walked the 2 miles. She turned up the lane toward the cottage. She raised her hand to knock on the door. The door opened before she touched it. The woman standing in the doorway was wearing a dark blue morning dress, well-made pressed, not the worn gray shawl and the drab skirt of the gathering. Her white hair was pinned back neatly. Her gray eyes were the same. Utterly unmistakably the same. Elizabeth went completely still. The woman looked at her. The woman looked at the basket. The woman said, with an expression that was doing several things at once, surprise and recognition, and something that might have been underneath both of those, a quality of profound relief, "Miss Carter." Elizabeth heard her own voice come out very carefully. "You're not a widow." "No," the woman said. "You're not poor." "No, you're not—" Elizabeth stopped. She looked at the woman's face. She looked at the gray eyes. She looked at the way the woman held herself, the posture of someone accustomed to standing at the head of things. She thought about Nathaniel in the chapel saying, "She's been asking about you." The kind where she pretends she's only making conversation, but is actually gathering information. She thought about a particular way of holding a teacup that she had seen in Nathaniel's study on the one occasion she had been inside Whitmore Manor to return a book when Margaret Whitmore had been seated by the fire. Not Martha. Margaret. Not a widow in a gray shawl. The woman who had been sitting by the fire. Elizabeth said very quietly, "You're his mother." Margaret Whitmore did not look away. "Yes," she said. "I am." The summer morning was very loud. Suddenly, birds, insects, the distant sound of something moving in the fields. Elizabeth stood on the step with a basket of bread and honey, and she felt the ground do something strange beneath her feet, not moving exactly, but rearranging. The way the ground felt after an earthquake that hadn't been large but had been thorough. "The gathering," Elizabeth said. "Yes." "The fall." "Yes." That was— Elizabeth stopped, breathed, started again. That was deliberate. Margaret was quiet for one moment. One very exact, very careful moment. Then she said, "Come inside." "No," Elizabeth said, not rudely. Just she needed the open air. She needed to be standing on actual ground while she processed this. "Tell me from here. Tell me plainly." Margaret looked at her. And then, with the posture of a woman who had decided a long time ago that she would see things as they were and accept the consequences of what she saw, she said, "I have watched many women pursue my son's attention for the better part of a decade. Women who performed kindness. Women who performed virtue. Women who calculated every gesture for maximum impression and then grew careless when they thought he wasn't watching." She paused. "I wanted to see what a woman did when she believed nothing important was happening." Elizabeth's hands tightened on the basket. "So you staged a fall." "I arranged a situation," Margaret said. "I did not know who would respond. I did not know you existed before that evening." "But you arranged—" Elizabeth stopped. "You were on the floor of your own son's ballroom, in a gray dress, pretending to be a servant. Testing the character of women who wanted to marry him. Testing the—" Elizabeth heard her own voice tighten and did something about it. She was not going to lose control of this conversation. She was going to be precise. "And when I helped you, that was what, the answer to your test." "It was information," Margaret said. "Significant information. And every conversation we had afterward, you introducing yourself as Martha, asking about my family, all of it," Margaret confirmed. "Though I want to say—" Her voice shifted slightly, became something less composed and more human. The conversation was real. Whatever else it was, the conversation was real. You made me laugh. I don't find many people who make me laugh like that. That, Elizabeth said, is not the point. No, Margaret said quietly. It isn't. Elizabeth stood there. She stood there and felt the full shape of what she was holding. The fall, and Martha, and the walks, and the Thursday mornings, and the fork road, and her aunt's tea, and every conversation she'd had with Nathaniel, where she'd thought with great careful deliberateness that she was choosing this with her own eyes open and her own judgment intact. Her own judgment. Her own judgment that had not known she was standing in the middle of someone else's test. Did he know? Her voice was very flat. Did Nathaniel know what you were doing? He knew I intended to find a way to observe the women who came to the gathering, Margaret said. He did not know the specifics. He did not know about you until after. But he knew you were testing people. Yes. Elizabeth breathed. And when he came to the chapel, she said, when he walked the road with me, he knew what you'd done. He knew you'd seen me help you. He knew that was why. She stopped. Was any of it his own idea, or was he following your direction? Elizabeth. Margaret stepped forward. My son is not a man who follows anyone's direction, including mine. I told him your name. I told him you were real. What he did after that was entirely his own. But he knew I'd been evaluated. He knew I'd passed some kind of... He knew you helped a woman who was on the floor, Margaret said clearly. He came to the chapel because he wanted to know who you were. I cannot speak to what he would have done if I hadn't pointed him toward you. I can only tell you that the man who has been walking that road for 6 weeks is not doing it because his mother told him to. Elizabeth looked at her. How would I know that? She said. How would I know the difference? Margaret was quiet. That was the honest answer. That was the real answer. And the fact that Margaret Whitmore gave it to her, the silence, the acknowledgement that she couldn't answer, it was the first thing since Elizabeth had arrived at the door that felt entirely unmanipulated. I came here, Elizabeth said, with bread, for a woman I thought was alone and might need help. She looked at the basket. That's all I came to do. I know, Margaret said, quietly. That's exactly who you are. Don't, Elizabeth said. The word came out harder than she meant. She softened it. Please don't tell me who I am right now. I need to figure out what to do with who you are first. Margaret nodded. She took a step back. I won't ask you to forgive it, she said. I'll only ask you to consider that it came from love of my son. A wrong-headed expression of it, perhaps. But love. Elizabeth turned to go. Then she stopped. She set the basket down on the doorstep. She didn't look back. Your knee, she said. The morning after the gathering. How bad was it really? A pause. Quite bad, Margaret said. 2 weeks before I could walk without a stick. Good, Elizabeth said. And she walked away down the lane, and she did not know whether she meant it as punishment or as confirmation that the fall had been real or both. And she walked the 2 miles back without stopping and went into her aunt's kitchen and sat down at the table. Ruth came in, looked at her, sat down. Something happened, Ruth said. Yes, Elizabeth said. Bad. Elizabeth thought about it. I don't know yet, she said honestly. I genuinely do not know yet. Ruth put the kettle on. Nathaniel found out the same afternoon. Not from Elizabeth, she hadn't come to him, and he hadn't expected her to, and the fact that he was waiting without quite being able to stop himself was its own information. He found out because his mother came to find him in the study at 2:30 with the expression she wore when she had done something she believed was right and was prepared to defend, but wasn't entirely comfortable defending. He recognized the expression. He'd seen it before. It had typically preceded discoveries of varying degrees of disruption. I need to tell you something, she said. All right. Elizabeth Carter came to the cottage this morning. He straightened. What? She brought bread, for the widow she thought was living there. His mother paused. She figured it out, Nathaniel. She recognized me. He was very still. What did you tell her? The truth. His mother sat down. Everything. The gathering, the fall, all of it. She asked directly, so I answered directly. She asked. He stood up. How was she? She was. His mother looked at her hands. She was controlled. She was very precise. She was the kind of calm that a person gets when they're saving the storm for somewhere private. A pause. She wanted to know whether what you'd done was your own idea or mine. What did you tell her? The truth, his mother said again. That I told you her name and that she was real. That what came after was yours. And did she? She left, his mother said. She left the bread on the step, and she left. She looked at him. Nathaniel, I may have... She stopped. Started again. I may have been too certain. Nathaniel looked at his mother. This woman who had managed the Whitmore household for 40 years, who had navigated 3 economic panics and 2 floods and a fire, and the death of his father, and who had done all of it with the particular immovable composure of someone who believed deeply that the right action chosen for the right reasons would eventually come right. Too certain, he said. I wanted to protect you, she said. And instead I may have... She looked at her hands again. She came to that cottage with bread, Nathaniel, for a woman she'd helped once months ago, with no expectation, no information about who lived there, just instinct toward kindness. She looked up. I staged a test to find out if she was real, and she showed up spontaneously doing the exact thing the test was designed to measure. And then I had to tell her it had all been arranged. I was already at this door. Nathaniel, his mother said. I need to talk to her, he said. She may not want to see you right now. I know. He stopped in the doorway, looked at his mother. But I'm not going to let her sit with the worst possible interpretation of this without hearing from me directly. He paused. She told me once that she prefers plain speech because it saves time. I'm going to try to believe that's still true. He rode hard. I took the road to the Carter Simmons property and turned up the lane and dismounted at the gate, and he knocked, and Ruth Simmons opened the door and looked at him with the expression of a woman who had already processed the relevant information and arrived at her verdict. She's in the kitchen, Ruth said. Don't make me regret letting you in. Yes, ma'am, he said. Ruth stepped aside. He went to the kitchen door. Elizabeth was at the table. She had both hands around a cup of tea that had probably gone cold an hour ago. She didn't look up immediately when he came in. He stood in the doorway and waited. She said without looking up, You knew what she did. I knew she intended to test the women at the gathering, he said. I didn't know how. I didn't know she'd gotten down on the floor. I found out after. And when you found out after? When she told you it had been arranged. When she told you my name. She finally looked at him. You came to the chapel anyway. Yes. Why didn't you tell me? This was the question. He'd known this was the question all the way across the county on the road. He'd thought about how to answer it, and he'd come up with one answer, and it was the true one, and it wasn't comfortable, but it was what he had. Because I didn't know how, he said. Because I came to the chapel on a Tuesday morning to thank you for something real, and I met a real person, and somewhere in that first conversation, I stopped thinking about what my mother had done and started thinking about you. He paused. And then it got harder to tell you because the longer I left it, the worse it looked. And I told myself you'd never find out, which was cowardice. He said that plainly. I was a coward about it. I knew it was a thing you deserved to know, and I chose not to disrupt what we were building because I was afraid of losing it, and that was wrong. Elizabeth looked at him. It was wrong, she said. Yes, he said. It was. I trusted you, she said, with very specific things, the things I don't give easily. Her voice stayed steady, but he could hear what was underneath it. The careful, controlled edge of someone keeping a real wound from becoming the whole conversation. I told you about my father. I told you about my aunt. I took you to her tea table, which I have never done with anyone in 3 years, and I did all of that believing I was making my own choices with my own information. You were, he said. I need you to hear that. What you chose, every conversation, every walk, that was yours. I didn't manufacture any of it. I didn't direct it. I just showed up and hoped, and everything you gave me you gave because you decided to." "But the beginning wasn't clean," she said. "No," he said. "The beginning wasn't clean." She looked at the table. He said quietly, "Elizabeth, I can't undo the beginning. I can't make my mother not have done what she did. I can only tell you what is true right now, which is that I have spent 6 weeks knowing exactly who you are, with no arrangement, and no test, and no management of any kind. And everything I know about you is something you showed me yourself." He paused. "And that I am asking you not. My mother asking, not a test. Asking me to tell me whether you're willing to let the beginning be wrong while we make the rest of it right." Silence. A long silence. Ruth Simmons appeared briefly in the doorway with the specific invisibility of a woman who had learned when to be present and when to pretend she wasn't. She looked at Elizabeth. She looked at Nathaniel. She disappeared. Elizabeth said very quietly, "I don't know whether I'm angrier at your mother or at myself." "At yourself." He frowned. "Why yourself?" "Because I should have asked more questions," she said. "Because I knew something felt different about how this started, and I told myself the feeling was just that I was just being cautious, and I walked past it." She looked at her hands. "My father always said that the thing you don't look at directly has the most power over you." "He was right," Nathaniel said. "He usually was." She was quiet for a moment. It's very inconvenient being a person who believes in plain speech, and then finding out that the person you've been trusting to speak plainly to you withheld something plain. "It is," he said. "I'm sorry." She looked at him. She looked at him for a long time with those precise gray-blue eyes that had seen him clearly. He realized from the very beginning. From the first Tuesday at the chapel, when she'd said, "I find it saves time," and she'd been right. She'd been right about everything she'd said, and the fact that she was still sitting in that kitchen, letting him say his piece, rather than having Ruth throw him out the door, was information about who she was that he was not going to take for granted. "Your mother," Elizabeth said. "She's going to be—" She paused. "She's going to be part of your life. For the rest of your life. Whatever else happens." "Yes," he said. "Is she going to do this kind of thing again?" "I'm going to have a very direct conversation with her about that." "I'd like to be there for that conversation," Elizabeth said. He stared at her. "If this—" She stopped, breathed. "If I'm going to be making decisions about whether I trust the Whitmore family, I'd like to see how that family handles being wrong, whether they handle it directly or whether they handle it the way they handle most things." She met his eyes. "Which is, as far as I can tell, with excessive planning and insufficient communication." He heard what she was saying. He heard the whole shape of it. "Saturday," he said. "Come to the manor on Saturday. We'll all sit down." "I'll bring the bread," Elizabeth said. He looked at her. "Martha never got it," she said. "She left it on the step." A pause. "Your mother, she may as well have it." "Oh." "And there underneath everything. Underneath the hurt and the recalculation and the specific wound of a trust that had been real and had still been incomplete." There was something else in Elizabeth Carter's face. Something that had not gone out, no matter how thoroughly the morning had tried to extinguish it. He recognized it. He'd been carrying it himself for 6 weeks. He was going to be very careful with it. He said Saturday. She said Saturday. And he rode home in the late afternoon heat, with his heart in considerably better order than it had been an hour ago, and with a very clear idea of what he needed to say to his mother, and with the certain knowledge that the woman he had left in that kitchen was quite specifically the most remarkable person he had ever had the privilege of being held accountable by. Saturday came in hot and still. The way, late July, always arrived in Virginia, without apology, without gradation, just suddenly and completely present. Elizabeth wore her good dress. She did not tell herself it didn't matter what she wore. She had decided somewhere between Friday evening and Saturday morning to stop lying to herself about small things. The small lies were where the bigger confusions began. She wore her good dress, and she braided her hair neatly, and she picked up the loaf of bread she'd baked that morning and walked out to meet the Whitmore carriage that Nathaniel had sent. She'd told him not to send it, and he'd sent it anyway, and she'd almost turned it away at the gate, and then decided that particular battle was not the one she needed to fight today. Ruth stood at the door and watched her go. "Be precise," Ruth said. "I'm always precise," Elizabeth said. "Be kind too," Ruth said. "Being right and being kind aren't the same thing, and you'll need both today." Elizabeth looked at her aunt for a moment. "I know," she said, and she meant it. The ride to Whitmore Manor took 20 minutes. Elizabeth spent them looking out the window and running through what she intended to say, and what she intended to hear, and what she was going to do if the conversation went in a direction she hadn't prepared for. She had been doing this since Friday afternoon. She had prepared for most directions. She was fairly certain one or two would surprise her anyway. Life in her experience had a talent for the direction you hadn't considered. Nathaniel met her at the door himself, not a servant. Him in his shirt sleeves and riding boots, which told her he'd been outside that morning doing something practical, which she found against her intentions reassuring. He took her hand briefly, just her hand, just for a moment, a greeting, and said, "She's in the blue sitting room. She knows you're coming. She's been sitting there since 8 o'clock this morning trying to look like she hasn't been thinking about this for 2 days. It's been 2 days, Elizabeth said. How much thinking is appropriate? For my mother, 2 days is the warm-up. He paused. Elizabeth, thank you for coming. Don't thank me yet, she said. I haven't decided anything. I know, he said. Come in. The blue sitting room was exactly as she'd pictured it from the one time she'd glimpsed it small for a manor, which made it feel inhabited rather than displayed with a fire that wasn't needed in July, but was lit anyway, because Margaret Whitmore appeared to be the kind of woman who made fires when she was working through something. She was sitting very upright in the chair nearest the window. The footstool was gone. The knee was apparently better. Her hands were folded in her lap with the particular stillness of a woman exercising considerable self-control. Elizabeth came in. Nathaniel came in behind her. Nobody sat immediately. Margaret looked at Elizabeth. Elizabeth looked at Margaret. And Margaret said, I owe you an apology. The directness of it, no preamble, no positioning, just straight to it, caught Elizabeth slightly off balance. She had prepared for defensive. She had prepared for reasoned justification. She had not quite prepared for this. You do, Elizabeth said. I arranged a situation that put you in the center of something without your knowledge or consent, Margaret said. I made a judgment about how to protect my son, and I executed it in a way that treated other people as instruments rather than as people, including you. She paused. I don't regret wanting to protect him. I regret the method, and I regret that you are now paying a price for something I designed without thinking sufficiently about what it would cost. Elizabeth held her ground. What price do you think I'm paying? The county is talking about you, Margaret said. They were talking before Friday. They'll talk more now when people realize Nathaniel has been spending time at a small property on the East Road, and that the woman there is the same woman who helped me at the gathering. She didn't look away. I created the conditions for that, not you. I created some of the conditions, Elizabeth said. I chose to walk with him. I chose to invite him to my aunt's table. I made choices that I believed were mine, and they were mine even if the beginning was arranged. She paused. What I'm angry about is not what happened at the gathering. What I'm angry about is that I was making decisions without all the information. That's not something I can be argued out of being angry about. No, Margaret said. It isn't. Nathaniel, who had been standing near the fireplace, with the particular stillness of a man who understood this was not his conversation to manage, said nothing. I need to ask you something, Elizabeth said, and I need a plain answer. All right, Margaret said. Did you tell your son to pursue me? Did you direct it? Did you instruct him in any way about what to say or how to approach me? Margaret met her eyes. No, I told him your name. I told him that you were real. I told him he was a fool if he let the county's opinion of your circumstances prevent him from finding out who you actually were. That's the full extent of what I said. And everything he said to me after that was his, Margaret said firmly. I know my son. I know when he's following a script, and I know when he isn't. He hasn't been following a script. A pause. He's been terrified, which is how I know it's real. He's very calm when things don't matter to him. Elizabeth looked at Nathaniel. He looked back at her with the expression of a man who was not going to dispute his mother on that particular point. Terrified, Elizabeth said. Of losing it, Margaret said simply. Of saying the wrong thing. Of you deciding the beginning was too wrong to build past. She looked at her hands for a moment. He sat in the study on Friday evening after he came back from your aunt's house, and he didn't eat dinner. I've been watching this boy sit through difficult things since he was 4 years old. He ate his dinner every time. Every flood, every loss, every disappointment. He ate his dinner. She looked up. He didn't eat Friday. The room was very quiet. Elizabeth looked at Nathaniel. Is that true? I ate breakfast, he said. That was Saturday, his mother said. He didn't argue. Elizabeth sat down. Not in the good chair, she took the plain one, the same one he'd chosen at her aunt's house. Something moved through Margaret's expression when she did it. Recognition, maybe. Or confirmation of something she'd already known. I want to say something, Elizabeth said. And I need both of you to hear it completely before you respond. All right, Nathaniel said. I am not a test result, Elizabeth said. I am not the answer to a question your mother designed. I am not the woman who passed the examination and therefore earns the reward. She kept her voice even. I am a person who helped someone who was on the floor because that is what a person does. I walked a road with a man because I found him honest, and that mattered to me. I made choices based on who I understood myself to be, and I will not allow any of that to be reframed as performance, not by the county, not by this family, and not by myself. She looked at Margaret. What I did at the gathering was not for you. It wasn't for him. It was because I didn't know how not to do it. And that's the only version of it I'm interested in carrying forward. Margaret looked at her for a long moment. Then she said, I know that. That is precisely why I told my son to find out who you were. Then understand, Elizabeth said quietly, that the woman who does things because she doesn't know how not to do them is the same woman who will tell you plainly when she's been wronged. And I have been wronged, not irreparably, but genuinely. She paused. And I need that acknowledged before anything else. It's acknowledged, Margaret said, without hesitation, completely and without qualification. Elizabeth looked at Nathaniel. Acknowledged, he said. And I'm sorry. Not because things turned out all right. Because it was wrong before we knew how it would turn out. That was the right answer. It was exactly the right answer, and Elizabeth held it for a moment, the way she held things that were important carefully, without rushing toward what came next. All right, she said. Now we can talk about the rest. The rest took the better part of 2 hours. They talked about the county, and about what people were saying, and about what Margaret believed the longer-term shape of public opinion would be. She had Elizabeth discovered a remarkably clear-eyed read on the social geography of Virginia that had very little sentiment in it and a great deal of accuracy. They talked about what it would mean practically for Elizabeth to be associated with the Whitmore name in any formal capacity. The scrutiny, the expectations, the specific cruelties that people extended to women who rose above their original station and were never entirely forgiven for it. They talked about Ruth. She'll need to be part of any conversation about what comes next, Elizabeth said. She's not a courtesy consideration, she's my family. Of course, Nathaniel said. And I'll need to keep teaching, Elizabeth said. The children at the chapel. That's not in question, he said. Some people will make it a question. When the situation becomes whatever it becomes, some people will say it's inappropriate. That a woman in my position ought to be managing a household, rather than teaching a minister's children to read. Those people, Nathaniel said, will be wrong, and I'll say so directly. Elizabeth looked at him. You'll say so to whom? To whoever needs to hear it. Including Caroline Holt's mother. Something moved through his face, not quite a smile. Especially her. Margaret, who had been listening with the quality of attention that seemed to be a family trait, said, There's something else. Both of them looked at her. The gathering, she said. The story of what I did. It's going to come out eventually. People will find out that Martha and Margaret Whitmore are the same person. When that happens, the question will be how it's framed. She looked at Elizabeth. I would like your permission to frame it truthfully. Not as a test that you passed, but as a meeting. An accidental revelation of character in a moment that was not manufactured to reveal it. She paused. The bread on Friday morning. The walk to the cottage. None of that was my design. That was you. Elizabeth was quiet. If the story comes out, Margaret continued, I want it known that the woman who is part of this family was not selected. She selected herself by being who she is in every moment that wasn't being observed. She met Elizabeth's eyes. I thought I was setting a test. What I actually witnessed was a person going about her ordinary life with extraordinary consistency. Those are different things. Elizabeth looked at her for a long moment. You're very good, Elizabeth said, at finding the framing that serves everyone's interests simultaneously. I'm very good, Margaret said without apology, at seeing what's true and saying it in the way most likely to be heard. A beat. I think, Elizabeth said carefully, that I'm going to find you profoundly irritating and deeply admirable in roughly equal measure for a very long time. Margaret's eyes sharpened with that specific delight. The feeling, she said, is mutual. Nathaniel looked between the two of them with the expression of a man who was simultaneously relieved and slightly concerned about what he had initiated. He walked her out at 5:30. The heat had broken slightly in the late afternoon, that small mercy that Virginia occasionally offered in July. The air still warm, but the brutal weight of midday lifted enough to make movement comfortable. They walked to the gate together, and Nathaniel told the carriage to wait, and they stood at the gate, with the late light coming at a long angle, and neither of them was in a particular hurry. I need to ask you something, Nathaniel said. You've been working up to it for 40 minutes, she said. I wondered when you were going to get there. Since before dinner, he admitted. My mother's presence made it complicated. Your mother's presence makes most things complicated, Elizabeth said. Ask. He turned to face her. He was not? She noted, performing calmness. He was actually not calm, she could see it. The particular tension of a man who has arrived at the edge of something important and is about to step off it with full knowledge of the drop. I have been looking, he said, for a very long time for someone I could be honest with. Not someone who would accept my honesty and perform gratitude for it. Not someone who found my directness charming in the way people find things charming when they want something from you. Someone who would be honest back, who would tell me when I was wrong, who would not disappear into what I wanted her to be. He stopped. I have been looking for someone who would stay as herself completely, even if staying as herself made things difficult. Elizabeth was very still. I found that, he said. In you. In 6 weeks of Tuesday mornings and Thursday mornings and midday walks and a tea table in your aunt's kitchen, I found every version of the thing I was looking for. And I'm aware that the beginning was complicated, and I'm aware that you're not the kind of woman who makes decisions without being certain, and I'm not asking you to decide anything right now. He met her eyes. I'm only asking whether, all things considered, you're still willing to find out. Elizabeth looked at him. She thought about Friday morning, and the basket, and Margaret's doorstep, and the way the ground had rearranged itself beneath her feet. She thought about sitting at her aunt's kitchen table with cold tea and the specific weight of discovering that something you'd built in good faith had an unknown foundation. She thought about how that weight had felt and whether it had changed the structure above it. Whether the conversations on the road had been different conversations once she knew. Whether the man who'd stood in her aunt's kitchen and said I was a coward about it was a different man from the one she'd been walking with. How wasn't? That was the thing she kept arriving at. The man who had been honest about his cowardice was the same man who had been honest about everything else, and the cowardice itself. The withholding of an uncomfortable truth, because he was afraid to lose something. Real was not a thing she could hold entirely separate from herself, because she had done versions of the same thing and knew exactly what it felt like from the inside. I need you to understand something, she said. Tell me. I am not going to become a different person, she said. Not for this county, not for your position, not for anything. I will walk into whatever this becomes as exactly who I am, and the woman I am is not always convenient and is not always quiet, and will not pretend she doesn't notice things that are worth noticing. She held his gaze. I need to know you understand that. Not in the abstract, in the practical daily reality of it. I don't want you to become a different person, he said. I fell in love with... He stopped. The word sat between them. Elizabeth felt her breath change. He had not planned to say it. She could see that plainly. He'd said it the way she said things when she'd been careful too long, and the truth finally decided. It was tired of being managed directly without ceremony, and with the slight dazed quality of someone who has heard their own words arrive ahead of their intention. I fell in love, he said more carefully now, with the person who was already there. I don't want to manage her, I want to know her. Every inconvenient, precise, plain-spoken version of her. He paused. I'm sorry. I didn't intend to say it like that. How did you intend to say it? I don't know, he admitted. I didn't plan it. I've been very thoroughly planning this conversation for 2 days, and that particular sentence was not in any version of the plan. Elizabeth looked at him. She was aware of her own heartbeat in a way that was specific and inconvenient, and entirely consistent with the honesty she'd committed herself to. I haven't said it, she said. I want you to notice that I haven't said it. I noticed, he said. It's not because I don't... She stopped. I need more time, she said. Not because I'm uncertain about you, but because I'm certain about me, which means I know what it means when I say a thing like that, and I won't say it until I can say it without any reservation at all. That's fair, he said. It might take a while, she said. I have 11,000 acres, he said. I can wait. She almost laughed. Don't make me like you more right now, she said. I'm trying to be composed. How's that going? Poorly, she said honestly. He smiled. The real one. The one that changed his whole face that she had been failing to be indifferent to for 6 weeks, and was apparently going to continue failing to be indifferent to for the foreseeable future. Elizabeth, he said. Yes. Will you consider it, he said. All of it. Whatever this becomes. She looked at him. She thought about her father, who had loved her mother without strategy or calculation, and who had never once in her memory performed his love for an audience. She thought about Ruth, who showed love with bread and plain speech, and getting up before 5 to start the fire. She thought about the specific thing she wanted, not the county's idea of it, not the romantic stories she'd read in her father's books, but the real, practical, breathing, actual thing, which was to be known, and to know someone, and to have that knowing be a choice made every day in clear light with full information. She had more information now than she'd had 2 weeks ago. More information than she'd had the Thursday she'd said, "All right, I'll be here Thursday." She had seen him angry on her behalf. She had seen him accountable. She had seen him not eat dinner. She had seen him stand in her aunt's kitchen and say I was a coward about it, without once trying to make the cowardice sound better than it was. Yes, she said. I'll consider it. He let out a breath. Don't look so relieved, she said. It means I'm going to be asking a great many more questions. I know, he said. I've been looking forward to it. She shook her head. She turned toward the carriage, and then she stopped because there was something else, something she'd been carrying since Friday that she hadn't quite resolved. Your mother, she said. The sitting room today. She said she was wrong about the method. She was, Nathaniel said. She was, Elizabeth agreed. But she wasn't wrong about everything. She looked at the gate. She went looking for something real, in a world where most people perform and very few people simply are. She went looking for someone who was real, and she used a bad method, but the instinct underneath it wasn't wrong. She paused. I want her to know that. Not because I'm forgiving the method, but because I'd rather she know her instinct was right than have her carry the full weight of the wrong method for longer than necessary. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. You want me to tell her? I'll tell her myself, Elizabeth said. But not today. Today was enough. Yes, he said. It was. She told Ruth everything that evening. All of it, including the thing Nathaniel had said without planning to say it. Ruth listened without interrupting, which was unusual. When Elizabeth was done, Ruth sat for a while in the particular silence she used when she was thinking something through to its actual conclusion, rather than its first obvious stopping point. Then she said, "He said it without planning to." "Yes," Elizabeth said. "And that's the part you keep coming back to." Elizabeth looked at her tea. "It's the most honest thing I've ever heard anyone say," she said quietly. "Not because it was eloquent, because it wasn't." Ruth nodded. "Your father proposed to your mother in the middle of a sentence about something else entirely," she said. "He was talking about the garden, apparently. He said, 'And I want to marry you,' and then continued talking about the garden as though he hadn't said it." She paused. "Your mother said she knew then it was real, because he hadn't prepared it." Elizabeth was very still. "She told you that," she said. "Once," Ruth said. "A long time ago." She looked at her niece. "She said the prepared ones are the ones who want something from you. The unplanned ones are the ones who simply can't help it." The kitchen was quiet. Elizabeth said, "I'm not there yet. I told him that." "I know," Ruth said. "You will be." "You sound certain." "I am," Ruth said simply. "I've been watching you walk that road for 6 weeks pretending you aren't happy about it. You are a very good liar in all other areas, Elizabeth Ann Carter. That particular one has never worked on me." Elizabeth looked at her aunt for a long moment. Then she put her face in her hands, which was not something she did often, and she stayed there for a minute, and she felt her aunt's hand come briefly and firmly to her shoulder. Not comforting exactly, just present. Just confirming that someone was there, and then Ruth took her hand back and said, "More tea," in the completely normal tone of a woman for whom that was the appropriate next step. "Please," Elizabeth said into her palms. 3 weeks passed. They were different weeks from the ones before. Not better or worse, but different with a quality of honesty in them that the earlier weeks had been working toward and had not quite reached. She and Nathaniel walked the road, and they talked as they always had, but without the thing she hadn't known was there before, the layer of incomplete information that had given every conversation a slightly unsteady quality she'd noticed without knowing what it was. It was steadier now. Everything was out in the open, including the things that were unresolved, and the things that were unresolved were at least honestly unresolved, which was its own kind of solid ground. She went to the manor twice. Not just for Margaret, for Nathaniel, who had a study that contained, she discovered, a genuinely impressive collection of natural history volumes and a window that looked east over the land, and who read in the mornings the same way her father had, with his whole attention completely present, as if nothing else existed. On the second visit, she found him in the back of the property behind the kitchen garden that had been his father's. He was standing at the edge of it in his working boots, looking at it with the expression of a man who had decided to do something and was not quite sure where to start. "What are you doing?" she said. "Thinking about beans," he said. She looked at the garden. It had been maintained, someone kept it from becoming truly wild, but it had the quality of a space that was being preserved rather than used. A garden waiting for something. "My father and yours talked about beans," she said. "They did," he said. "Then you should probably start with beans." He looked at her. "I don't know what I'm doing." "I know," she said, "but you have to start somewhere." She looked at the garden. "I'll show you if you want. My aunt grows them. They're not complicated." He was quiet for a moment. "Elizabeth," he said. "Yes." "I would like you to show me," he said. "Everything, all of it." He paused. "I'd like to learn everything about this, and I'd like to learn it with you." She understood that he was not only talking about the garden. She stood at the edge of that quiet kitchen plot in the late August sun, and she felt something settle in her. Not a decision exactly, because she'd told him she needed time, and she'd meant it, but something adjacent to a decision. Something that was deciding itself quietly and thoroughly without being asked. She said, "Hand me a stake." "What?" "For the beans," she said. "They need something to climb." He looked around. He found a length of wood near the fence post. He brought it to her. She took it from him, and their hands overlapped briefly on the rough wood, and neither of them moved for a moment. Then she pushed the stake into the ground firmly and evenly the way her aunt had taught her. "There," she said. "Now you try." He took the next stake. He tried. It went in crooked. "Straighter," she said. He adjusted. "Better," she said. "Not perfect." "You're learning," he said, echoing her words from weeks before. She looked at him. Something moved through her face, something she didn't try to manage. "Yes," she said. "We both are." They worked the garden for the better part of an hour, not talking much, just working the way people worked together when the work was enough, and the company was enough, and nothing needed to be added to make it sufficient. When she left that evening, she was almost to the gate when she heard him call her name. She turned. He was standing where she'd left him in the working boots and the shirt that was dusty from the garden. And he looked. She thought she would remember this for a long time, the specific way he looked in that late light, like a man who had come home to something he hadn't known he'd been missing. "Come on Sunday," he said. "Not for dinner, not for a conversation, just come." She looked at him across the distance. "Sunday," she said. She turned back to the gate, and she was smiling before she reached it, and she did not try to stop herself because her aunt was right and some lies she was done with. She came on Sunday. It was the last day of August 1818, and the heat had finally begun to yield, still warm, but with the first suggestion underneath it that summer was considering its position. She came early. Nathaniel was already in the garden. He had a book open on the fence post which he was consulting with the expression of a man who had spent Saturday reading about beans and was not entirely confident in the results. She took the book from him without asking. "You've been reading the wrong chapter," she said. "I've been reading the whole book." "The whole book is about everything," she said. "You start with the chapter about your specific soil type. Everything else is secondary." She handed it back open to the correct page. "Here." He read. He asked questions. She answered them. They planted the second row of stakes correctly, both of them together, getting the angle right. At some point, she couldn't have said exactly when his hand came to rest against her back. Briefly. Lightly. Just the weight of it just present. She did not move away. He did not make it more than what it was. They kept working. An hour later, his mother appeared at the garden gate with 2 cups of tea in her hands. She looked at them, at Elizabeth with dirt on her hands, at Nathaniel with his book open on the fence post, at the 2 of them standing in the garden that had been waiting for someone to use it again, and something moved through her face that Elizabeth had not seen on it before. Something that looked underneath the composure and the sharpness and the considerable intelligence like simple relief. She set the tea down on the fence post. She said to no one in particular, "He'll need heavier stakes in the second row." "I told him that already," Elizabeth said. "Good," Margaret said, and she turned and went back to the house. Nathaniel picked up his tea. He looked at the row of stakes they'd put in. He looked at Elizabeth. "She likes you," he said. "I know," Elizabeth said. "It's extremely inconvenient." "You like her too," he said. "I know," she said. "That's the inconvenient part." He smiled. She didn't look away from it this time. She let herself look directly at the thing she'd been not quite looking at for 8 weeks, and it was exactly what she'd known it was, and she was done pretending otherwise. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes." She looked at him. She said, "I'm there." He went very still. "I know you know what I mean," she said. "And I know I said I needed time, and I did need it, and I had it, and I'm telling you where I am now because I don't know how not to." He set down his tea. He took her hand, the one with the dirt on it, both of their hands, dirty from the same ground, and he held it the way people held things that were real and important, and that they intended to keep. "Elizabeth," he said. "I know," she said. "You don't have to say it again." "I want to," he said. "I want to say it when you know what it is, when it's not accidental." He paused. "I love you. I love who you are. Every direct, inconvenient, plain-spoken version of you." She looked at him. She thought of her father and the garden and the sentence about something else entirely. She said, "I know, I can tell." And then, because it was true, and she had decided to be done with the lies. She told herself, she said, "I love you too, And I think I knew it on the fork road the first time you said you'd be there Thursday. I just wasn't ready to carry it yet." He looked at her for a moment with an expression she had no word for, not joy, exactly something quieter and more permanent than joy, the way deep water was quieter than its surface. "What made you ready?" he said. She looked at the garden. At the stakes they'd put in together, crooked and adjusted, and finally straight. "Something to climb," she said. The engagement was announced in September, not with ceremony, not with the elaborate social machinery that Virginia expected when a family of the Whitmores standing made a declaration of that nature. Nathaniel told his mother on a Monday morning over breakfast, using approximately 14 words, and his mother set down her teacup and said, "I know," in the tone of a woman who had in fact known, since the Sunday afternoon, she'd brought 2 cups of tea to the garden fence and found Elizabeth Carter with dirt on her hands, and her son looking at the world like a man who had just remembered why he was in it. He told Reverend Howell on Tuesday. Reverend Howell shook his hand and said, "About time," and then looked slightly embarrassed about having said it, and Nathaniel told him there was no need to be embarrassed because it was accurate. Elizabeth told Ruth. Ruth said nothing for a full minute. Then she said, "Your father would have liked him." Elizabeth said, "I know." Ruth said, "He would have liked him because he's honest when it costs him something. That's the only kind of honest that matters." Elizabeth said, "I know that too." Ruth stood up, put the kettle on and said, "We'll need to let out the good dress." And that was the end of the conversation, which was exactly the right length. The county found out the way the county always found out, through the particular social osmosis that moved information from household to household, without anyone being able to say precisely who had said it first. By Wednesday afternoon, it was known. By Thursday morning, it had opinions attached to it. By Friday, those opinions had arranged themselves broadly into 2 camps. The people who found the match surprising and were prepared to say so in whatever terms were available to them, and the people who found it unsurprising and were prepared to defend it. The second group was smaller than the first, but it was louder than Elizabeth had expected. Mary Henderson stopped by the Carter-Simmons property on Friday with a jar of preserves and the news that the Henderson family was entirely pleased, and that Elizabeth should know that Mr. Henderson had told 3 separate people that Nathaniel Whitmore had more sense than the entire county combined, which was high praise from a man who distributed praise the way he distributed money, which was carefully and only when fully warranted. Reverend Howell mentioned from the pulpit that Sunday, not by name, not directly, that a community revealed its character in how it treated a match that confounded its expectations. He did not look at anyone in particular. He didn't need to. And Margaret Whitmore, who had said nothing publicly since the announcement, received callers at the manor on Thursday afternoon, with the particular serenity of a woman who had already decided exactly what she was going to say, and to whom, and who had arranged the sitting room accordingly. Caroline Holt's mother came. Elizabeth was not there for this. She heard about it afterward from Nathaniel, who had heard it from Thomas, who had been present in the adjacent hallway, doing something that Thomas would later describe as entirely coincidental. Mrs. Holt sat in Margaret's blue sitting room and said with the careful warmth of a woman managing her displeasure into something presentable that she was of course delighted to hear the news and that Miss Carter was certainly. She paused precisely long enough to make the pause do work, a remarkable young woman in her own way. Margaret looked at her. Margaret said, "She is remarkable in every way, including ways that I suspect will continue to surprise people who underestimated her, including myself on occasion." She paused. "I watched that woman walk across an entire ballroom to help someone no one else would help. I watched her do it without knowing who I was, without any expectation of return, and without a moment's hesitation. I have been watching people in this county for 40 years, Mrs. Holt. I know the difference between performance and character." She lifted her teacup. "There is no difference in Elizabeth Carter. What you see is what she is, all the way through." Mrs. Holt left shortly afterward. Nathaniel, when he told Elizabeth, kept his expression very neutral. Elizabeth said, "Your mother is terrifying." "She is," he agreed. "I mean that as a compliment." "She'll be glad to hear it," he said. "She'll take it as one." The wedding was set for June of 1819. Not because they wanted to wait that long. Elizabeth would have married him in October, and been entirely content, but because there were practical matters that required time, and because Ruth had opinions about the dress that required additional time, and because Margaret had quietly suggested that giving the county 9 months to become accustomed to the idea before they were confronted with its formal completion was strategically sound. Elizabeth had looked at Nathaniel when Margaret said this. Nathaniel had said, "She's right, unfortunately." Elizabeth had said, "I'm marrying into a family of tacticians." Margaret had said, "You're a tactician yourself. You simply call it plain speech." Elizabeth had thought about that for a moment and decided it was probably accurate and declined to argue. The 9 months were not idle months. Elizabeth continued teaching at the chapel. She had in the weeks since the announcement 2 more children added to her Tuesday and Thursday classes. Families who had previously sent their children to a school in the town that was beyond their means and who had apparently decided that association with the Whitmore name meant the chapel reading circle was now a suitable option. She said nothing about this. She taught the new children alongside the old ones with the same patience and the same directness. And if the subtle arithmetic of social acceptability had shifted in her favor, she was not going to make a fuss about it, but she was also not going to pretend she hadn't noticed. Nathaniel came to the chapel less frequently once the announcement was made. Not because he wanted to, he told her plainly that the Tuesday mornings were the best part of his week, but because Elizabeth had told him equally plainly that showing up at the chapel while she was teaching was going to become a distraction for the children now that the engagement was public, and that she needed those hours to belong entirely to the work. He accepted this without argument. She noted that he accepted it without argument. She filed it in the place she kept things that told her who he actually was when the principles cost him something. He came to Ruth's table every Saturday instead. He came in working clothes more often than not, and Ruth fed him without ceremony, and they had developed. Elizabeth watched this happen with a kind of quiet amazement, a friendship of their own. Not a warm, demonstrative friendship. A Ruth-style friendship, which meant Ruth said things that were accurate and occasionally uncomfortable, and Nathaniel listened without flinching, and Ruth respected him for the listening, and said so approximately never, but made it clear through the second cup of tea that was always poured without asking. One Saturday in November, Elizabeth came into the kitchen to find them in a conversation about land management that had apparently been running for 30 minutes. Ruth was explaining something about drainage, and Nathaniel was taking notes on a folded piece of paper with the attention of a man who understood that the information mattered, and that the source of it was not someone to condescend to. Elizabeth stood in the doorway. Neither of them looked up. "The east field," Ruth said. "Your grandfather made the same error. Your father corrected most of it, but the northeast corner still drains wrong after heavy rain. I've watched it for 20 years. Nathaniel looked up. "You've watched it for 20 years. "I walk that road," Ruth said. "I notice things." He looked at Elizabeth. Elizabeth looked at the ceiling. "We should talk to the land manager," Nathaniel said. "You should talk to the land manager," Ruth said. "And then you should walk the northeast corner yourself. Men who manage land from a desk manage it badly." "I'll walk it Monday," he said. He walked it Monday. The land manager, Thomas reported later, had been informed of approximately 4 things he had not known and had not entirely enjoyed being informed of. Thomas delivered this information to Elizabeth, who was at the manor for a fitting with the dressmaker Margaret had insisted on, with the particular neutral expression that meant Thomas considered it a satisfying outcome. "He walked the whole thing," Thomas said. "I know," Elizabeth said. "He told me. He got his boots very muddy. He came straight to tell me about the drainage problem," Elizabeth said. "He was extremely muddy. I told him he looked like my father used to look after a Sunday morning in the garden." Thomas permitted himself something that was almost a smile. "What did he say?" "He said that was the best thing anyone had said to him in recent memory." She looked at the dressmaker's pins on the table. "I think he meant it." "He did," Thomas said with the quiet authority of 9 years. "He always means it." The winter was harder than usual. January came with ice storms that closed roads and left the outlying farms isolated for days at a stretch. Elizabeth spent 2 weeks helping Ruth manage the neighbors. The Hendersons' sick daughter had improved over fall, but the cold set her back, and 3 families on the East Road were short of wood, and Elizabeth and Nathaniel between them organized the distribution of fuel and food. With the same unadorned efficiency, they applied to the garden and the beansteaks and the Saturday conversations at Ruth's table. He did not make a production of it. She noticed this too. There were men in Virginia who would have turned that kind of charity into a social event, who would have made certain the right people knew the right names were behind it. Nathaniel sent Thomas with the carts and told Thomas not to make speeches. Elizabeth walked with the deliveries herself and said only that there was plenty at the manor this winter, and that the roads would open in time, and that if anyone needed anything else, they should send word. Caroline Holt's mother received a cord of wood along with everyone else. Elizabeth found out because Thomas mentioned it. She asked whether Nathaniel had known. Thomas said he had. She asked whether anything had been said about it. Thomas said Mr. Whitmore had said only that cold was cold, regardless of whose house it was in. She told Nathaniel that evening that he had surprised her. He said, "How?" She said, "I thought you might have left that particular delivery to someone else." He looked at her. "Why would I?" She held his gaze. "Because you're human, and she was unkind about you, and she was unkind about me, and most humans find it easier to let the cold be its own teacher." I was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "My mother said something to me once. She said that the way you treat people who can't help you is the measure of who you are. Not who you are in public, who you are." He paused. "I've been watching you operate by that measure my whole life without knowing it had a name. I'm not going to stop now just because someone made it inconvenient." Elizabeth looked at him for a long moment. She said, "I love you." Not the first time she'd said it. Not the careful, considered version from the garden in August. This was different, the version that arrived without preamble, in ordinary moments. The version that said simply, "This is what you are, and I see it completely, and it is enough and more than enough." He took her hand. He didn't say anything. He didn't need to. June arrived, the way. The best things arrived in Elizabeth's experience, not with fanfare, but with a quality of inevitability that made it feel less like an event and more like a continuation. The morning of the wedding, Ruth braided Elizabeth's hair the way she'd braided it for church every Sunday of her childhood, without ceremony, without tears, with the steady hands of a woman who had loved her plainly and consistently for 23 years, and was not going to change her method now. When she was done, Ruth looked at her in the small mirror. She said, "You look like your mother did on her wedding day." Elizabeth said, "Is that good?" Ruth said, "Your mother was the most beautiful woman I ever saw on that particular morning." She picked up the pins. "So yes." Elizabeth looked at herself. She thought about the summer gathering 12 months prior, the borrowed carriage, the Henderson girls and their whispers, the plain blue dress, the column at the edge of the room where she'd stood and watched and decided she had as much business being anywhere as anyone else did. She thought about an old woman in a gray shawl sitting alone in a corner. She thought about how fast she'd moved across that floor, how she hadn't stopped to think, how the only thing in her mind had been, "She's on the floor and nobody is helping her." She thought of all the things I have ever done that cost me nothing. That was the easiest thing. That was just what you did. And it had changed everything. "Ruth," she said. "Yes." "Thank you," she said, "for 3 years of mornings and bread and plain speech and telling me the truth when I needed it and not telling it when I didn't." Ruth's hands stilled briefly. Then she said, "That's what family is for." And she gave Elizabeth's shoulder the same brief, firm pressure she'd given it on the Friday afternoon. Elizabeth had sat at the kitchen table with her face in her hands, and she turned away and said, "Come on then, people are waiting." The ceremony was at the chapel. Not the Whitmore family church in town, with its columns and its carved pews and its long history of housing significant social occasions. The chapel. Her father's chapel with the wooden floor and the good windows and the mockingbird in the oak outside that had apparently decided this location was permanent. It had been Nathaniel's suggestion. He'd said, "It's where I first understood who you were. It seems right." Right. She'd said, "It has a very modest pulpit." He'd said, "I don't need a large pulpit. I need the right room." She'd looked at him for a moment. "You're going to keep saying things like that, aren't you?" "Fairly regularly," he'd said. "I've stopped trying to plan them." The chapel held perhaps 60 people. They filled it 60 people who had been selected not by social obligation, but by actual connection. Reverend Howell, who cried in the dignified way of men who have decided crying is acceptable, but are not going to make a production of it. The Henderson family, including the daughter who had been sick and was now pink-cheeked and healthy, and sat in the second row with enormous solemn eyes. The 3 children from the reading circle, scrubbed and uncomfortable in their good clothes, sitting with their families and looking alternately bored and deeply invested in the proceedings. Ruth sat in the front row with the expression of a woman who had done her job and done it well and was allowing herself for one morning to feel satisfied about it. Margaret Whitmore sat beside her. Elizabeth noticed this when she walked in. The 2 of them side by side in the front pew, Ruth with her hands folded and her back straight, and her expression neutral in the way that meant she was managing something considerable, and Margaret with her own hands folded and her own back straight, and a quality of stillness that Elizabeth had come to recognize as Margaret at her most genuine. They were not speaking. They didn't appear to need to. Nathaniel was standing at the front of the chapel with Reverend Howell, and when Elizabeth walked in, he turned and looked at her, and the thing that happened on his face was not the performed admiration of a man at a social occasion, but the unguarded recognition of someone seeing exactly what they expected and being fully, completely glad. She walked toward him. She passed the column where she'd stood a year ago watching. "She thought I had as much business being anywhere as anyone else. I was right." She reached him. He said quietly, just to her, "You look like yourself." She said, "Is that good?" He said, "It's the best thing I can think of to say." She said, "Then it'll do." Reverend Howell, who had overheard this, pressed his lips together in the way of a man suppressing a smile in a professional context. He opened his book. He began. The wedding breakfast at the manor afterward was the first Whitmore social occasion in Elizabeth's memory, which was admittedly 1 year old, that felt like a gathering rather than a performance. People ate. People talked. Children ran in the garden where the beans had come in well over summer and had been replanted that spring with considerably more confidence and considerably straighter stakes. Margaret moved through the room with the efficiency of a woman who had hosted 100 such occasions. And if there was something different in how she moved today, something lighter, some small abatement of the constant calculation, Elizabeth thought she might be the only one who noticed it. She noticed most things. She was standing near the garden gate with a cup of tea when Margaret came to stand beside her. They looked at the garden, at the beans. "He tends them himself," Margaret said, "every morning." "I know," Elizabeth said. "He tells me." "He hasn't tended anything himself since his father died," Margaret said. "He hired people to manage everything, every field, every garden. He said he didn't have time." She paused. "He had time. He just hadn't found anything worth doing himself." Elizabeth looked at the beans. "Mrs. Whitmore," she said. "Margaret," the older woman said. "I think we've arrived at Margaret." Elizabeth looked at her. "Margaret." She paused. "I want to tell you something. I've been meaning to say it since last autumn, and I've kept not saying it because the timing never seemed right, and I've decided the timing is never going to be perfect, so I may as well say it now." Margaret turned to look at her. Her gray eyes were steady. "Your instinct was right," Elizabeth said. "What you were looking for. The thing underneath the method which was wrong, the instinct was right. You went looking for someone real in a world that rewards performance. That was not a wrong thing to want for your son." She paused. "And I want you to know that I understand that. I don't agree with how you went about it, but I understand why." Margaret was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I spent 40 years managing everything I could manage. My husband's health when it failed, the estate after he was gone, my son's grief, and then his guardedness, and then his isolation." She looked at the garden. "I thought I could manage this too. Find the right person, arrange the right conditions, ensure the right outcome." A pause. And instead, a 23-year-old minister's daughter walked into my test and made it irrelevant in approximately 4 minutes by being so entirely herself that no test was needed. Elizabeth said nothing. "That's the thing I've had to make peace with," Margaret said. "Not that I was wrong to want to protect him, but that you didn't need protecting from. That you were never the kind of person who required management. That all my arranging was—" She stopped. "Unnecessary." "It brought him to the chapel on a Tuesday," Elizabeth said. "You would have met him another way." "Maybe," Elizabeth said. "But we met the way we met. And the garden needed someone, and the children at the chapel are reading better, and your knee is fully recovered, and I am standing here on my wedding day." She looked at Margaret. "I'm not going to spend the rest of my life resenting the path that got me here. It would be a waste of a good path." Margaret looked at her. "My son," she said very quietly, "is the luckiest man in Virginia." "Hi is," Elizabeth agreed. "I intend to make sure he knows it." The corner of Margaret's mouth moved. "I suspect you'll manage that without any difficulty." "I suspect so too," Elizabeth said, and she almost smiled. Late in the afternoon, when the guests had thinned and the children had fallen asleep in various inconvenient locations, and Ruth was drinking tea with Reverend Howell in a corner with the ease of two people who had independently decided they were done being social and were going to be done together, Elizabeth found Nathaniel in the garden. He was standing where he always stood at the edge of the bean rows, looking at what they'd built together. She stood beside him. I didn't say anything immediately. Neither did she. That was one of the things she had learned about this man over 12 months, and which she was prepared to go on learning for the rest of her life, that his silences were not absence. They were presence of a different kind. She had learned to live in them, the way she'd learned to live in Ruth's silences, which were the same quality of thing, and she thought there was probably something in that about who she had always needed and had simply taken some time to find. "Nathaniel," she said. "Yes." "Are you happy?" He turned to look at her, and the thing that happened on his face was not complicated. It was not the careful, measured expression of a man who had spent 6 years performing contentment. It was simple and direct and entirely real, and she would know the difference for the rest of her life. "Yes," he said, "completely." "Good," she said. "So am I." He put his arm around her, not ceremonially. Not with the performance of a man demonstrating affection for an audience. Just naturally, the way you held something that was yours and that you intended to keep. And she leaned into it without reservation. And they stood together in the garden, his father had loved, and that he was learning to love, and that she was learning alongside him. The mockingbird was going again. Same tree. Same relentless, magnificent repertoire. "He's still at it," Nathaniel said. "He's always at it," Elizabeth said. "Doesn't he ever stop?" "I don't think stopping is in his nature," she said. Nathaniel was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I used to think the whole world was a performance, that everyone was calculating all the time, and the only honest response was distance." He paused. "I was wrong." "You were wrong," she agreed. "Not about the calculating. About the only honest response being distance." "What's the other response?" She looked at him. "You walk toward it," she said. "Toward the people who aren't calculating. You find them, and you don't let the distance win." He looked at her. "Like walking across a ballroom floor," he said. "Like walking across a ballroom floor," she agreed. The afternoon light was going long and golden, the way it did in Virginia in June, and Ruth was laughing at something Reverend Howell had said. A real laugh, Ruth's laugh, which was not deployed carelessly, and Margaret was standing at the manor door with a cup of tea and a quality of stillness that was not loneliness, but was satisfaction. And the children in the garden were beginning to stir from their inconvenient naps, and the beans were coming in straight and strong on the stakes they'd learned to set together. Nathaniel held her close. She let him. And years later, when people in Virginia told the story of how Nathaniel Whitmore had found his wife, and the story had grown, as stories do, into something slightly larger and more polished than the truth. The part they always kept. The part that never changed in any version was this: that a young woman in a plain blue dress had walked across a crowded ballroom floor to help a stranger no one else would help. Not because she was brave, not because she was performing, not because she knew who was watching, because she didn't know how not to. And that single unconsidered entirely characteristic act had been the beginning of everything. Margaret Whitmore said it best in the end. She said it to Reverend Howell on the day of the wedding in the chapel before the ceremony began, while people were finding their seats and the mockingbird was warming up in the oak outside. She said, "I spent 30 years looking for someone worthy of my son. I arranged situations and set conditions and managed expectations with all the skill I had. And in the end, the woman who deserved him most walked into my test and made it completely irrelevant by simply being who she was." She looked at the front of the chapel, where Elizabeth stood with her father's Bible and her aunt's steady presence, and the entire unhurried certainty of a woman who had always known her own worth and had simply waited for the world to catch up. "You cannot arrange for a person like that," Margaret said. "You cannot design her or test for her or manufacture the conditions that produce her. She simply exists, walking toward the people. Everyone else walks past, doing the necessary thing, without stopping to ask whether it's worth it, being the same person in every room, regardless of who is watching." She paused. "All I did," she said quietly, "was make sure my son was in the right room when she walked across it." And Reverend Howell, who had known Elizabeth Carter since she was a girl, reading her father's books in the back pew of that same chapel, said, "She would have crossed any room. That's who she is." And Margaret Whitmore, who had spent 68 years being right about most things that mattered, said, "Yes, that is exactly who she is." And the mockingbird sang, and the morning held, and Elizabeth Carter, who had come to a summer gathering in a borrowed carriage with no fortune and no family name, and nothing to offer the world but the full, uncompromising entirety of herself, became Elizabeth Whitmore, and never once stopped being exactly who she had always been. That was the whole of it. That was enough. That was everything.